Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Throne of Heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 16, Threat. Ichigo had been checking over Tatsuki's recovery while Rukia reported the result of their chase to Urahara. He hadn't realized how hurt his friend was in the immediate aftermath of the battle, and once able to actually take notice of her condition, he'd been almost sick with worry. Luckily, it seemed like Orium's healing pyramid could heal pretty much everything. Considering how banged up Orium herself had ended up after her own fight, he wasn't sure if this was a blessing or a curse. How likely were the two of them of taking even crazier risks from now on, if they just knew they could recover from anything without side effects? Before he could think over the matter much more, the voice of Ishida cutting through Rukia and Urahara's dialogue had him refocus his attention on them. The Quincy sounded deeply skeptical. How can you be so sure your tracker won't be detected? Items don't really have the ability to keep their own riots suppressed. We Quincy use more items than any other group. I know how hard it is to hide a signature, and keeping up a spell from such a distance uninterruptedly can't be feasible. Urahara grinned. You would be right on that. Rukia frowned, and commented. Actually, I think if I had the time to set up properly, maybe a Bakudo capable of doing it would be possible, in theory. Create a shifting portal that drains away the overflowing Ryotsu and dumps it directly in Hueco Mundo, have it be self-sustaining by draining a bit of what it's draining to feed its own power necessities. Of course, the real trick would be to add some visual camouflage, but... Before she could say more, Urahara placed a finger on her lips and said, turning back to Ishida. As I said, setting aside untested experimental Kido that haven't even been invented yet, you would be right. And I'm certain our target would be really paranoid about it, so we can't take the risk that untested experimental Kido might fail, no matter how skilled the creator of it. Thus, I decided to take a diagonal approach, something Hirako won't be expecting at all, and, thus, I expect we'll go completely undetected. Then, the shopkeeper pulled out what looked like the oldest laptop Ichigo had ever seen. It took about 2 minutes to boot up, and once it did, it seemed to be running an operative system that Ichigo had never seen before, nor, if the looks of confusion on his face were anything to go by, had Ishida. Urahara himself, however, had clearly full understanding of what he was doing, for he started to type at the keyboard with a quickness and precision that spoke of long practice. He didn't have a mouse and clearly didn't seem to need one, as a number of different windows opened in successions until a final one popped up, showing what, to Ichigo, looked like a map of Karakura town from the sky, with a glowing red dot on it. Rukia looked at the screen with great interest as well, but it was Ishida who asked, perplexed. So, you have their position, but how? Oh, that's quite easy really. I just used a mundane, completely non-spiritual tracer, putting it inside the console so it'd be invisible from the outside and neither damage it nor make it so different as to affect its spirit wasn't easy, but I managed. And the upside is that Hirako was a Shinigami, so he won't be expecting us to use mortal means to track him down. Let me tell you, it's pure genius. Ichigo shook his head at the Shinigami's self-congratulatory attitude toward himself, while Ishida looked really quite surprised, as he commented. How did you come up with this kind of idea? You just said it, Shinigami don't usually pay much attention to what we invent here in the mortal realm. I had the impression you would consider it beneath yourselves. Urahara nodded along at that, and answered, his voice turning serious. Sadly, where most of my people are concerned, you would be right. Soul Society is steeped in silly traditions and practices that have hamstrung our development and seen us losing ground against the modern society on Earth with each passing decade, especially this last century. I've seen the fast development of mortals with my own eyes, and I find it both amazing and humbling. It shows with clarity that Soul Society needs to change, that keeping to old traditions and past glories is stunting its growth and keeping it from being all that it could be. It was clear from Urahara's eyes that he had true passion for what he was saying, and the fire in his voice wasn't something Ichigo thought he could fake. The man let silence linger for a moment after his pronouncement, but then brightened, returning to his more congenial attitude as he continued. I can't wait to get back to Soul Society and get the change underway. Captain Aizen agrees with me. We've talked about the matter a lot. Soul Society needs to be changed, and once he has our success with this mission at his back, Once he can counter the continuous objections that have stymied his effort to push Seoul society into the future by showing that we could stop a threat of this size just by doing things our way, the nobles won't have a ground to stand on anymore. We'll bring Seoul society into the future together, and that starts here, now, with us. Ishida looked quite taken aback by Urahara's words, while Ichigo couldn't help but feel somewhat inspired. He smiled at Urahara's words. It was nice to get a better understanding of the man's motivations, and then asked, mostly out of curiosity. Would just one successful mission be enough to allow for this change you want? I got the impression Aizen has been a Capitan for a long time, so if he really wanted change, why didn't he try for it before? He has tried, believe me, he has tried many times. But Seoul society is too stratified, and to obtain the authorization to put many of his ideas into practice requires a vote from the Central 46, our government, that he's never been able to gain. Even so, the captain has done a lot for keeping Seoul society, if not at the same level of advancement as the peak of the material realm, at least on a ground of parity. He has introduced a large number of minor ideas that have compounded on each other over time. Plus, even if he's the smartest man I know, not even he can come up with infinite ideas. I've provided a lot of new suggestions for him to think to possibly implement that he had never thought about, as has Rukia, and many others besides, even Mayuri, with all that 2/3 of his ideas are inapplicable due to being too dangerous and unethical, comes up with many projects that nobody else would have thought of. I have confidence that, with our help, Captain Aizen can achieve change, it's just a matter of time. Ichigo let out a chuckle at that, and commented. You really put a lot of trust in Aizen, don't you? Urahara nodded, but before he could continue, Ishida spoke up, a very thoughtful expression on his face. Say, how long has Aizen been at the lead of your research division? Urahara seemed to think it over, but Rukia answered more quickly. About 1,500 years. Ishida blinked, while Urahara smiled and commented. Did your brother had you memorize that? She looked bashful at the comment, but nodded and answered. Not just that, he wanted me to learn the name and time in charge of every division captain in the history of the Godi 13. Then she turned to Ishida, and elaborated on her answer to his question. Captain Aizen is actually the 5th longest serving captain in the Godi 13, and the 3rd captain of the 12th division. He's the one most responsible for having reorganized it the way it works today. Before his time, every member had their own project they worked on their own in a very individual fashion, but Captain Aizen made it so that we have research teams that coordinate projects together as part of the entire division's greater goals. He's a firm believer that the only way to achieve anything is by having a single mind with a clear vision guiding a group that works together to bring that vision about by each providing their own contributions to it. He's a real visionary. She then cocked her head to the side with clear curiosity as she asked. Why do you want to know? Ishida shrugged and answered. Just trying to get a sense for how your Godi 13 operates, is all. I've never had the chance to interact with Shinigami this directly before, so a lot of what I know is what other Quincy speculated about. Some clarity is welcome. Rukia nodded, apparently satisfied with that. Then Chad, who had been looking at the beeping light on the map, asked. So, what now? We just charge this spot and capture the thieves, so that your mission is over. That would not be prudent. Everybody turned in the direction of the voice, where Ichigo had once again to concede to himself that Yoriyuki was just much too sneaky for him to detect. She kept appearing as if out of nowhere and he only realized she was there once she'd revealed herself. With all attention focused on her, she went on, in a serious tone. While the rest of his companions are nothing special, Hirako Shinji is an opponent far beyond any of you. Indeed, I'm the only one in this room who has the power to take him down. You see, before he became a thief, Hirako was a captain of the Godi 13. Ishida nodded in clear understanding at that, but Ichigo was left confused by it. He really hadn't gotten a clear explanation of what that meant, and why the mere fact of having a title like captain should mean so much. I don't really get it. So he commands one of your groups. I get he's strong, but that Grand Fisher guy we sent running killed several of your lieutenants, according to Rukia, and that's the 2nd highest rank, isn't it? Seems to me like we'd be able to win if we have surprise and numbers on our side. Yoriyuki glared at him, then said, her tone cold. And that's why you'd get slaughtered. She walked on air until she was sitting in front of him, and went on. There are 4 Shinigami arts: Kido, Hakuda, Hoho, and Zanjutsu. You've trained a bit in each of those. I would say you're past the apprentice level in all of those fields, about the equal of a trainee. That's quite good, actually, and you're well-rounded enough that, if you were an actual Shinigami, that'd about qualify you for a unseated officer spot. To be accepted as a captain, however, you need to be a master in each of the 4. If you aren't, you won't be given the spot unless you're so good with one of those skills to be a grandmaster. A sense of power started to seep from Yoriuki's cat form, and Ichigo could see the air deforming from it. It wasn't spirit pressure, it was as if she was affecting the air itself with some reality warping effect well past anything he'd seen her do before. She continued, tone harsh. Just so we're clear, to be declared a master you need to pass an examination under a grandmaster of the same field, where you prove that you know and can execute to perfection every existing ability, trick, or power within that field of expertise. But being a master in all fields is not enough to be accepted as a captain. You also need to have developed Uzanpakuto to the ultimate limit, which means, having achieved Bankai. You've mentioned that before. What is a Bankai? This time, it was Rukia who answered, in a reverential tone. It's the ultimate step of communing with a Zanpakuto. At first, you're given an Asachi, which is a sword that is predisposed to absorb fragments or ryotsu leaking from your soul as well as those of anything you slay with it. Through the years, this absorption develops a soul within the Asachi that is based primarily on your own, but also with traces of anything you've ever done with it, thus gaining both a seine of what its purpose is, as well as what your own goals are. Rukia looked longing for a moment, as she went on. When the spirit finally awakens, the Asachi becomes a Zanpakuto, and you can commune with the spirit. You already know the benefits of this. The spirit can guide your movements, watch your back, give you some of its own power or store some of your own to either empower itself or help you hide, and similar things. Then, you and the sword learn about each other, until you know its name and can call it to manifest in real life in its awakened form, which is called Shikai. Bankai is the following step, the last one, when you draw the spirit inside your own, and become one with it, the power of 2 souls unleashed as one. It's the ultimate communion, and can only happen when you and the sword both trust each other absolutely. More to the point, they are vastly more powerful than any power you've ever seen before. Yoriuki's tone was serious, creating a stark contrast with Rukia's more whimsical description, as she went on. There is no power greater than that of multiple souls fused together, and when there is absolute harmony in that fusion, as is the case with Bankai, the effect is magnified 100-fold. The power of Bankai brings the wielder to a level above any other spiritual fighter. Ishida spoke up then, his tone polite but his eyes narrowed. While I've heard that said before, I've also heard that strong Quincy have faced Shinigami captains before, and given a good account for themselves. Yoriuki didn't seem impressed, as she asked. And did you ever heard many stories of them winning? Especially easy, one-on-one victories. Ishida had no answer to that, and the Black Cat went on. Bankai isn't a power like others, it's something beyond. It increases the power of a captain in direct confrontations, obviously, but the real power of it is in its impact on the flow of a battle. All Bankai, without exceptions, can wreck armies. Not once have I heard of one that couldn't defeat hundreds with a single strike. That's what sets them apart. She shook her head, then elaborated. The Bankai is always based upon what the released Shikai form does, but it evolves from it in a way that takes the power to a point where it allows the wielder to stand up to an entire army alone. To make a few example, Captain Commander Yamamoto has a Shikai that allows him to release waves of flames that he can control at will. With his Bankai, he can instead summon copies of anything and everything that his flames have ever incinerated, including any former enemies killed by them, each of which retains their old powers. Captain Aizen's Shikai, as you've heard, allows him to learn and perceive anything that a person he touched with his sword does. With Bankai, he instead create one individual copy of every person under the effect of the sword's power. Jin Ichimaru's Shikai allows him to grow his sword to infinite length and grants him the power to wield it, while his Bankai makes it capable of piercing and cutting through any material in existence, so that he could cut down hundreds with a single swing. Yoriuki paused there, checking to make sure her point had been clearly made, then went on. They're all like that. A Bankai makes the user more dangerous in a one-on-one combat, for sure, but the real strength of it is that, unless you have an equivalent power to stop their own with, something to equalize the ability, no amount of numbers is sufficient to take down a Bankai wielder. And of course, as I said, all the captains are masters of all 4 Shinigami arts, so defeating them in a duel is one of the hardest tasks one could imagine. That's what facing off against a Bankai is like, and since Hirako Shinji was a captain himself before he betrayed us, that's also what awaits for us once we finally manage to corner him. Ichigo frowned, and answered. You're making it sound like we don't have a chance against this guy. That's because you don't. Then what's even the point of it all? She slapped him on the head with her tail, and said. We've told you already, haven't we? You are to draw him out, and then I will take him down. He turned himself into a Vizard in the first place because he couldn't beat me with his strength alone, and even after he gave himself those extra powers, all it did was make it possible for him to run away. If I can fight him and you all can keep him from running, I'll win. Ishida seemed thoughtful at that, and he asked. What is a Vizard? I don't think I've heard the term before. Urahara spoke up at that point, sounding a bit tired. I guess I might as well explain everything, so you've a clearer picture of the situation. They turned to him, and the blonde man started to speak. Everything really started while I was studying some old data to start a new project and stumbled onto proof that somebody had been disappearing people from the Rokanga in pretty huge numbers. We're talking hundreds of people at once here, and this had happened multiple times. The data was very hard to come by and had clearly been masked in the 3rd Division's reports, the 3rd Division being the one in charge of guarding Rokanga, and of which Hirako Shinji was captain at the time. I brought the matter to Captain Aizen and Yoriyuki, since I'd been first seated officer in the 2nd Division for a time, and we decided to investigate the matter together. The cat nodded at that and took up the tale in a grim tone. Once Aizen informed me of Urahara's findings, I obviously launched my own investigation, since keeping watch over the Godei 13 to make sure Shinigami don't violate the laws is the 2nd Division's whole job. However, Hirako must have got wind of this, as before I could get my hands on conclusive proof, he used the Hujioku on a number of his own subordinates and other Shinigami in the area. From what we managed to gather, the total group included 5 members of the 3rd Division as well as a member of the 11th and a teacher of the Shinigami Academy who'd once been in the 13th, to destroy all evidence. Urahara nodded at that, and explained. The Hujioku can control hollows absolutely, so using it, Hirako drew out a number of hollows and sealed them into the Shinigami. They were unable to control the monsters inside themselves and went on a rampage. That's what the Hujioku is capable of. Yoriyuki nodded. Indeed. I was on the scene, I saw him use the item and confronted him, I wounded him severely and retrieved the item itself, but he managed to escape, and Urahara saw that he only managed to do it thanks to help from Jin. We couldn't destroy the Hujioku, as it was the only possible means we had of curing the corrupted Shinigami, but Aizen was of the idea that, if Hirako had been able to steal the Hujioku from the 12th Division's lab once without anyone noticing, then he would make the attempt regardless of where we put it, so we decided to put it back in exactly the same place it was before, but this time with the trap lying in wait. Urahara nodded, and went on. However, Hirako somehow learned of the trap. He avoided Captain Aizen and Yoriyuki, creating a diversion by freeing the captured Vizard and setting them on a rampage again. However, I had remained behind toward the Hujioku itself, and faced off against him. He got the item, and also defeated me quite completely, but I did manage to hold on for long enough that Captain Yoriyuki made it on the scene. And that when he used the Hujioku to power up himself, unlike the other Vizard, it was clear he knew how the procedure worked already, likely from his previous experiments with it, because he was in absolute control of the inner hollow the whole time. Yoriyuki nodded. I hadn't expected such a move, so he managed to get away, and collected all the others Vizard before disappearing, escaping to the mortal realm. Plus, afterward we found out that, in addition to stealing the Hujioku, Hirako had also destroyed all of the research data on how to create it. Captain Aizen thinks he might be able to recreate it from memory, but seeing as it took him 600 years to do so the first time, and all the data that could be used to replicate the feat more quickly has been lost, Hirako's actions have ensured that, for the time being, he's the only one who has access to the technology. If Hirako could reach Soul Society again with a surprise strike, he could be able to turn half the Goatee I-13 into Vizard, which only he seems capable of controlling, and since we don't have access to the cure for it, he could easily leverage that into wiping out Soul Society as a whole. Rukia looked clearly angry at the mere idea, but Urahara squeezed her shoulder to calm her down while Yuriuki went on. Regardless, while we knew of Jin's involvement, we couldn't prove it. A large number of people saw me fighting Hirako during the Vizard's rampage, but only Urahara had seen Jin. I went to check Jin's quarters for answers, but instead all I found were obviously fake documents that would incriminate Jin, while the man himself led the captain commander there. This made them all believe I'd been working with Hirako all along, and was trying to frame Jin for my own wrongdoings, when in truth what happened is the exact opposite. And so, I had to leave. Urahara nodded, and concluded. And since we knew that Hirako had to have had a spy in the 12th Division to be able to steal the Hogyaka the way he did, we decided that I would go in exile with her. Captain Aizen pretended to have found me out, so that the spy would feel safe and become more likely to make a mistake, while my help here in the material realm would make it easier for us to track Hirako down, retrieve the Hogyaku and prove our innocence. Everybody nodded once Urahara's tale reached his end, then Ishida commented. That's quite a lot of information. So, if I understand correctly, these Vizard are Shinigami who absorbed the power of an Hollow, and that somehow made them stronger. Yuriuki nodded. Yes. While it's not on the same level as a Zanpakuto, it's still two souls sharing a body and powers. Hirako gained a portion of a Hollow's regeneration after he transformed himself, and he was able to drain Ryutsu in the same way he would from his Zanpakuto, basically giving him a second reserve of power above what any other Shinigami would have. None of the Shinigami that he transformed were particularly strong. The only notable one was a unseated officer of the 11th, while all the others were just rank and file, yet they became as destructive and powerful as seated officers or even lieutenants after the transformation. Still, you all have shown quite adept at fighting, so I'm sure you'll manage to defeat them. Just remember to leave Hirako to me, and all will be fine. Will we? Everybody turned to Ishida, who looked very serious as he continued. Do not misunderstand, I do not doubt your ability. But you said that a captain's Bankai can take down an army. Those you described could level city blocks in instants. Even if you have an equivalent power to this man, the two clashing would only cause more destruction, causing the harm of many civilians. Is that your plan? Do you think to let a lot of people die just to catch this thief? Ichigo was left aghast at the idea, as he tried to imagine an army of dead skeletons fighting against an army of clones. If each one was as powerful as Ichigo himself, he could just see in his mind the level of destruction that would result in. Then, he realized that, while the idea was new to him, Ishida had delivered it with a very plain, almost polite tone, if with the slightest of edge at the end, and suddenly he wondered if the Quincy had really needed that explanation on Bankai, or if he'd just asked it because he was aiming to ask this question from the very beginning, and didn't want Yuriuki to be able to back out of it. For her part, the cat captain didn't seem fazed by the point as she answered. The nature of Hirako's power isn't such that it'd cause widespread destruction. His Shikai allows him to mess with people's perceptions. He's no illusionist, can't make you see what's not there or not see what's there, but he can make you see it wrong, distorted, out of place and such. So long as you perceive his sword at the same time, you hear it swing, it'll mess with your hearing, you see it move, it'll mess with your vision, and so on. His Bankai merely expands on this. It allows him to spread a gas that will mess with all senses at once if you inhale it, and he can control and spread it to very large distances. Also, in addition to messing with the perceptions themselves, he can exchange the perceptions of everybody under the effect. It'll completely disable any chance at coordinating or mounting an offensive against him that anybody could have, and he's good enough to use it for enhancing the teamwork of his own subordinates, but it's not really going to cause widespread destruction by itself. Ishida nodded at that, apparently appeased. I see. That's reassuring, in a sense. And yours would be? None of your business. Yuriuki grinned, which as a cat looked extremely threatening, and went on. Only 3 people other than myself know what my Bankai does, and for that matter most people don't even know anything about my Shikai, and I'd rather keep it that way. As I've said before, secrecy is the most important thing in my line of work, and for a secret to be perfect, it needs to be maintained at all times. Be content to know my power would counteract Hiriko's in a safe yet hard-to-notice manner, and leave it at that. While she didn't say or else, Ichigo got the sense that it was meant to be there. Ishida, for his part, didn't look intimidated, worried, or even offended, merely nodding as he answered. Of course, I apologize for asking. Think nothing of it. Yuriyuki looked quite happy of having put the matter to rest, and Chad, who had been following everything in silence, brought matters back to his original question as he asked. So, if we're not striking at once, what is the actual plan? Rukia, want to answer this? The girl quickly nodded, then turned to the group. We'll be keeping watch over the area for now, to try and identify whether that's the headquarter of the group, or not. There has to be at least one of the visored there. Sensei here will be tailing whoever that is as soon as they leave, and once we identify a meeting place, the rest of us will start to hang around in the areas they frequent more often. I will give you pictures of each of the visored in a moment, so you can recognize them when the time comes. This way, we can keep watch on them without them realizing, since you're all humans and thus they won't expect you to be watching them. That sounded like a good plan to Ichigo, except for one thing. Won't Yukio have told them what we look like, especially once none of the other Fullbringers make it back to them? Rukia chuckled at that, lifting what looked like a very large straw hat and a humongous pair of star-shaped sunglasses and said, "That why we'll be using disguises. If they're going by description and have never seen us in person, they won't be able to recognize us if we don't look like our usual selves." Orium, who had moved closer to listen in along with Tatsuki once they'd both fully healed, snatched up the glasses with a huge grin and put them on as she declared. Yeah. All superheroes hide their secret identity with huge glasses, everybody knows that. Ichigo could feel the headache mounting even as he couldn't help but chuckle at Orium's enthusiasm. This was certainly not what he'd expected when he'd signed up for this whole thing. Urayu Ishida was still thinking about all that he'd learned today as he made it inside his master's apartment. The old man was sitting on a stool, eyes closed, so he waited to avoid ruining his concentration. The process by which he was absorbing loose reishi from the air was a key as to how the man was still capable of fighting, if nowhere near as well as he'd been capable of in his prime, and, from Ishida's understanding, it was an advanced variant of the ability named Blood. Blood was one of the key of the Quincy's fighting style. By absorbing loose reishi inside the body, particularly the blood, it strengthened their material body to the point it could survive the hardship of spiritual combat. It wasn't easy at all, and Ishida himself was only about halfway to mastery of that specific Quincy art. Most of all, it was dangerous because too much external reishi would be rejected by the body, in a manner not dissimilar to how normal blood transfusions could be, and could thus even cause death. Unless, of course, one was as skilled as Haiwan Jugram, and thus able to convert the absorbed reishi to match their own as they absorbed it, in which case the soul would integrate it and make the body more resilient and capable of resisting even the ravages of old age. Master Yuma was almost a century old, yet looked barely past 50, with very few wrinkles around his eyes, his long hairs and large mutton chops with connected mustache over jutting cheekbones still mostly black with only some small hints of gray in them, and a body that, despite old age, was clearly still muscled and strong. The man opened his golden eyes then, his gaze almost piercing in intensity as he seemed to examine Uriah for a few long moments, before nodding in acknowledgement of his presence. Uriah bowed in response, and then said, in his most respectful tone, "Master Haiwan, I'm back from a meeting with the Shinigami group. I've obtained some more intelligence on the enemy they're here to hunt, as well as on the ability of a number of the most powerful Shinigami in Soul Society." His master nodded, expression unreadable, and Ishida passed to him the note he'd written down with all the important information before summarizing. They seem fully certain that their target is capable of controlling hollows, and even absorb them into himself as a source of power, and that his ultimate goal is to wipe out Soul Society. I see. Has this new knowledge changed your intentions and plans, Urayu, or are you still aiming to help them subdue this enemy? Ishida made sure to take a moment before answering. Even though he'd made his decision long before coming here, it wouldn't do to make it seem like he was rushing into it without proper consideration. I still believe that, at this time, operating with the Shinigami would be the best decision. The man they hunt has been known to unleash the hollows he controls upon civilians. He's too much a risk to be allowed to do as he pleases. His master nodded, apparently accepting Uriu's position, before going ahead to ask. Does this mean you now trust the Shinigami to know what's best then? Ishida shook his head. Hardly. They're still far too secretive and far too focused on their own matters rather than the security and well-being of humans. Yet you seem to take them at their word on the danger posed by this enemy with surprising ease. Uriu could almost see Kurosaki in his mind as his master accused him of naivete, as if the mere idea of it brought the orange-haired boy to the forefront of his thoughts. Kurosaki was indeed pretty sure that the Shinigami were being fully honest about everything. He could understand why, lacking Uriu's own previous experience with them, the other boy would feel so, trusting to a fault and surrounded by friend who, while admirably loyal and brave, completely lacked in observational skill. He had no idea what real intrigue looked like. No, what made Uriu sure that, in this particular case, most of what he'd been said was the truth had to do with Rukia Kukaki. The Shinigami was impressive in multiple ways, but the one that had stood up the most to Uriu was how she seemed to be surprisingly self-sacrificing. She'd trusted Uriu during their miniaturized fight, putting her life on the line to ensure their survival, and then she'd proved herself as an exceptionally tactically minded individual when they'd had to fight together within her puppet body. She had a solid head on her shoulders, yet was genuinely earnest, and she seemed easy to guilt-trip. If the meeting with the Big Hollow was anything to judge by, Uriu doubted he'd have so easily been left paralyzed by the sight of a fallen comrade. Which meant, to his judgment, that she believed herself to be doing the right thing, not merely the thing that was best for Soul Society. She was still a spy, and a pretty talented one at that, so of course Uriu didn't really trust her in full, but he thought that his psychological model of her was precise enough. Any deception aimed at him would not be intended to hurt. It still might, but the lack of intent counted for a lot. Of course, smart as she was, she herself was trusting her own superiors, and those, Uriu had no trust for at all. Urahara Kisuke liked to play harmless but was surprisingly cunning, as his little trick with the tracker proved. He approached things from oblique angles, which meant taking him at face value about anything he did was idiotic. And obviously, the woman who was so skilled at concealing what she was that she could pass herself off as a cat to even the most dedicated of psychic scans was a lost cause. Anybody who would trust somebody that was so two-faced as to be able to change the very essence of their own deeper self, their soul, to such an extent, was an idiot destined to an early grave. No, he was sure the two leaders of the Shinigami were hiding something. Their story was too clean and polished, lacking any of the messy complications and shades of gray that real events had. For example, they hadn't said what motivation Hirako Shinji had for having done what he did, and while Kurosaki Ichigo probably missed it, he hadn't failed to notice that they'd implied Soul Society had annihilated whole cities in the past just to cover up a mistake. But in the end, whatever it was they were hiding, he wouldn't find out without interacting with them more, and regardless of even that, nobody who could control Hollows as if they were soldiers should be allowed to roam freely. Hollows were the first enemy. Taking out them and any who helped them took precedence over even fighting the Shinigami, since the whole point of their quarrel with Soul Society was that the latter refused to let Quincy handle the protection of people from Hollows on their own. Thus, his voice was firm as he answered, keeping his tone polite and respectful. I am merely prioritizing the greater enemy. I have seen the allies of this Hirako Shinji work with Hollows myself. Any other consideration should be set aside while such a threat exists. At those words, Master Haiwan finally smiled, and said to Uriu, Well argued, my disciple. I shall then allow you to continue to follow your own plan, and prevent your fellow students from interfering with it. Uriu offered another respectful bow, even as the smallest smile formed on his lips. His master was a demanding teacher and tested him continuously, but he only did it to ensure he was the best Quincy he could be, and this meant that, whenever he praised him like this, Uriu truly had proved himself. After a moment, his master then asked, in the usual patient tone. And did you find out anything new about your other concern? Uriu managed to control himself well enough that his breath didn't hitch, but it was a close thing. The other reason he'd decided to help Kurosaki and Kukaki with their mission, while objectively less important than ensuring a madman couldn't unleash armies of Hollows on the world, was nevertheless the one dearest to his heart. For this was the first time he'd been able to speak with somebody who might personally know those responsible for his grandfather's death. Uriu had not been at the scene where his grandfather was killed, but he'd examined it with all the skill he could muster afterwards, and he knew it had been Shinigami who murdered him. The signs were unmistakable. He didn't know why, however, nor the names of those who had done it. For a time he'd even gone as far as to suspect his own father to be connected to it all somehow. After all, Ryukin Ishida had never wanted Uryu to learn the arts of the Quincy and had a pretty bad argument with Uryu's grandfather about wanting him to stop teaching Uryu just a few days before the attack. Of course, he realized now that he'd just been childishly lashing out in his grief back then. If his father were willing to kill his grandfather, he'd not have allowed him to go to Soken's own teacher, Master Haiwan, to continue said teaching afterwards. Uryu could see now that he'd been putting himself at the center of the world, which was sort of expected by a child, but he still felt himself quite silly for doing. He wasn't the center of the world, and whatever the reason the Shinigami attacked his grandfather, it had to have been motivated by some political machination, some mad reason that probably only made sense from their twisted perspective. And still, he wanted to know what that reason had been. He wanted to watch the one responsible in the eyes and show them what happened to those that dared to hurt a Quincy. Kukaki and Kurosaki, with their connections to actual Soul Society authorities, were his ticket to that knowledge, and he wouldn't let go of such an opportunity quickly or easily. Still, thus far he hadn't learned much, so he answered. "Not yet, Master. Should I learn something, I'll let you know immediately." "Good. Soken was my disciple, and a dear friend. He deserved better than what happened to him." Uryu nodded, and silence fell on the two Quincy once again, before Master Haiwan finally asked. "And what of your training, have you progressed in some noticeable manner?" "Nothing worth showing, Master Haiwan." The man didn't seem pleased nor displeased, merely nodding, and saying, in a neutral tone. "Just keep up your practice and with the training I've assigned you, and you should soon reach a new breakthrough in your skills. We'll go over those in greater detail once you have." Uryu nodded, and bowed before taking his leave. He was just about to close the door behind himself as a smooth, deep voice said, in a tone that was very familiar to the young Quincy. "Hold the door for me, Uryu, would you?" He turned to regard the blond man that was about to enter the apartment. He was just a few years older than Uryu himself, and outside of the cut of his hairs and, of course, the same golden-colored eyes, it'd have been impossible to tell that he was the nephew of Master Haiwan. He was blond, for one, and while the old man had jutting cheekbones, a large and powerful build, and a large chin and mouth, this member of the Jugram family had very smooth features and a sleek body instead. Hashwal. Uryu knew that the man was by far the best of Master Haiwan's students. Of course, both of them had been training with him far longer than Uryu himself, and for that skill, Uryu respected him, but despite his absolute politeness the few times they'd met, Uryu couldn't help but always feel a sense of unease in his presence, which he was unable to explain. As usual, however, Hashwal didn't seem to notice, instead patting him once on the shoulder and greeting as he said, polite. "Is your undercover investigation with the Shinigami activities proceeding well?" "It is, thank you for your interest. Just looking out for a fellow student, is all. Should you need help, just let me know. It shouldn't be necessary, but your offer is appreciated." Hashwal patted him on the shoulder once more, before moving to go talk with his grandfather. However, before closing the door behind himself, he half turned to glance at Uryu and add, "I hope you find what you're looking for, Uryu. Your effort should earn you some success." Uryu limited his answer to a courteous bow, before quickly leaving, his thoughts quickly returning to how he should prepare himself for the battles to come. Shinigami captains were, as he'd been politely informed, quite the dangerous foe to face, so he needed to figure out something new if he had to be ready for them. Chapter 17, Misremembering. As they continued to tail the Shinigami that Rukia's photos identified as Gabrielle Burness, a tall and slender woman in her 20s with hairs blonde on one side and black on the other, Tatsuki couldn't help but think that this whole deal with acting secretly and stealthily was one of the most boring things she'd ever had to do. She didn't particularly like going around shopping, less so to pretend to be doing it while actually buying nothing, and least of all when she didn't have Orium's bubbly presence around to make the experience actually fun. Of course, she thought as she watched Sato next to her, it could have been worse. Ichigo's friend at least wasn't annoyingly smug like Rukia, eerily focused like Ishida, or even impatient like Ichigo. the latter was the worse because the two of them together tended to stir each other into a greater frenzy at the task which, after about 5 days of it, Tatsuki was starting to think was entirely pointless. Following Mashiro Kuna, a green-haired young woman, from the house where the kid Fullbringer was apparently hiding to various meeting places she used to contact her fellows had not been too hard, and that had helped them to track down 3 more of the member of the group they were chasing, the girl they were now following, Jerome Gibat, a hulking black man with black hairs arranged in cornrows, and Hachigen Ushoda, a fat man with a pink mustache, and how it was possible somebody looking like that had managed to avoid being tracked down by Yoriyuki for so long was a mystery, but the other two, a girl by the name of Hiyori Sakuragi and, of course, the leader himself, Hirako Shinji, wasn't proceeding well at all. Which, considering the two were, according to the files Rukia had on them, by far the 2 most dangerous members of the group, wasn't good. The plan, such as it was, required to know the position of every member of the team at the same time, so that a coordinated strike could take all the lesser visored down at once without any alarm being raised, before having everybody converge on the leader to lure him out, and trick him into revealing where the Hujioka was hidden before Yoriyuki would then show up to take him down. In theory, quite a simple process, but in practice, it needed them to know with certainty the locations of everybody, or it would not work, and of course moving before they were ready would have been a bad idea. But the more time passed, the more Tatsuki persuaded herself this wasn't going to work. The last 2 members of the team were clearly being more cautious than the rest, and wouldn't be so easily found out. Which left them to do nothing but continue these pointless stalking sessions with no end in sight. Your annoyance is showing. Tatsuki was startled by Sato's words, but then nodded and focused, closing her eyes and taking a few deep breaths as she regained control of her escaping Ryotsu, coaxing it back into a state of calm that wouldn't alert their target to her presence. She was once more glad that Ichigo and Yoriyuki had now started to teach her Ho-Ho alongside Hakuda, even as it was coming harder to her, it still came quite in handy, and not just for the air-walking technique, but also because it made control of herself much easier. The 2 styles really complemented each other as well as Yoriyuki had said, and she had been puzzled when she realized Ichigo didn't seem to have the same grasp of that as she did, before giving him a few pointers on how that worked. Which, she wouldn't lie, had felt good. It was nice to know that, even if she wasn't as good as him yet in practice, she had a better grasp of the theory at least. Pushing the thoughts of her training away, she finished sorting her emotion out before returning to checking over the clothes in the shop they were into as she whispered. "Thank you, Sato, I really was going out of control there." The big guy nodded back to her, before adding, sounding thoughtful. "You can call me Chad like Ichigo does, if you want, most of my friends do." She nodded gratefully at that, even as she focused her attention back on their target's window shopping. After a moment, as the boredom started to get to her again, Tatsuki let out a long breath to keep herself calm. "This whole thing feels entirely pointless, that's why I'm getting angry, it's like we're wasting time for nothing." "Maybe. But if we're patient, they'll make a mistake eventually." That sounded true, but also depressing. Still, as Tatsuki thought it over, she couldn't help but wonder. What if we provoked a mistake? You know, approached them, struck conversation, tried to get them to reveal something. That sounds too risky, dangerous. Tatsuki wanted to punch something at that, but restrained herself even as she hissed. "I know. But it's just so weird, to have to stay here doing nothing but watching, you know." Chad nodded at that, and Tatsuki was glad for his sympathy as much as she was for him helping her restrain herself from doing something rash, and then, just as their target was walking out of the shop with a bag of clothes under her arm, the sky just outside tore open, a hollow dropping down from it. She saw the visored gaze snapping to it, while the rest of the passers-by moved out unaware as the creature, a beast taller than a bus and with 6 muscled arms covered in spiked seashells and a mask like a corkscrew with a single glowing red eye inside it, let out a long chuckle as if looked around, taking in the entire street. Ah, so many little snacks scurrying about, perfect for an early lunch. Tatsuki didn't stop even a minute to think, that thing was going to kill people if she let it. She jumped out of her body and sealed it away in a single move, then dove through the window and shoulder tackled the hollow before its hand could grab a nearby man. The hollow glared at Tatsuki then, and went for 3 punches at once, striking with his entire left side. She let her new ho-ho training take in, so that hits that would have sent her flying before merely pushed her a bit as her body spread around the attacks rather than being hurt by them, before she struck back with her other hand wrapped in as much determination as she could. The direct hit as hard as stone but delivered with as much speed as she could by lightening her arm's weight, sending the hollow flying back until it smashed into a wall on the other side of the street. Even as the monster had half-phased past the wall and thus only lightly damaged it, it still had to spend a moment before it could free itself from it. As it did, it let out a furious roar, its attention completely focused on Tatsuki, and thus he didn't notice Chad until the tall boy grabbed his head in a armor-covered hand and, in the split second of hesitation that caused the hollow to have, let out his blast of energy from it, completely disintegrating the creature's head and its mask with it. Tatsuki grinned, rubbing her hands together in satisfaction even as she looked around to make sure that nobody had noticed the scuffle. She was invisible after all, as had been the monster and Chad's own blast, which was when she realized that, much as none of the civilians had noticed, somebody else had. And ran away as a result. Damn. This isn't good. Chad moved next to her, and Tatsuki quickly turned to watch him, worried, as she asked. Did you saw where she went? The tall boy shook his head. I was focused on helping you take down the hollow, and lost sight of her. Tatsuki sighed in frustration, kicking at a stone which, since she'd forgotten to harden her body back, didn't move at all while her foot went through it. She sighed, then asked. Do you think we did the wrong thing? That we should have just let that hollow attack? No. These powers, we have them to protect people. It's why we're helping Rukia in the first place. If we let people get hurt, we'd be unworthy of them. I suppose. Still, I'm not gonna enjoy explaining this to Sensei. That woman is terrifying. Never thought I'd dread the day I'd be stared down by a cat. Chad placed a reassuring hand over her shoulder, and commented. Maybe we can still find her? She can't have been gone far. Tatsuki brightened at that as she nodded, declaring with conviction. Right. Let's look around. If we do it right we might still be able to salvage this. Salvage what, exactly? Tatsuki and Chad both looked up to the rooftop, where they saw a man standing on the rooftop's edge and glaring down at them, a man with a katana on his shoulder, and wearing a very familiar dark kimono, but who Tatsuki had never seen before, with brown hairs arranged in a big afro that would have been comic in other circumstances. Right now, however, the only thing Tatsuki could think of was how much Yoriuki was gonna be scolding her. Not only had she lost their target, but they'd attracted the attention of a Shinigami. Gabrielle Burness let out a long breath after having double-checked that she'd not been followed. She'd been uncertain what to do about the hollow who had suddenly showed up in the middle of the day, but once she'd seen what looked like a spiritually powerful but otherwise irrelevant mortal had turned into a Shinigami to go hand-to-hand against an hollow in a manner very reminiscent of the Omnitsukido's preferred combat style, privileging Hakuta and Ho-Ho due to how often they'd leave their Zanpakuto behind to move around without detection. She'd booked it as quickly as possible. The Vizard muttered a few curses under her breath at having been found out by the 2nd Division, wondering what the best path forward would be. When she felt something brushing against her arm, she turned around immediately, but nobody was there, and then she realized the feeling had been because her bag of clothes had bumped into the small scratch on her arm she'd gotten while running away. She shook her head, then visibly calmed herself before leaving the hallway with a more determined step. Only once she was no longer within sight of the alley did Tsukishima emerge from the wall inside of which he'd been hiding, letting out the breath he'd been holding to avoid giving himself away. While he was good enough at stealth, this was a risky move he was making, yet, he could not see a better path forward. He looked down at his sword, Ion, as he considered this plan. By striking the girl without being seen, he'd ensured that he'd be able to affect her memories in such a way that, once he deactivated his Shikai, she'd just think that the plan she'd suggested Hirako Shinji to go with was her own idea, whereas right now she thought it something she'd discussed with him a long time ago, when they'd been good friends back in Soul Society, during a hypothetical conversation about just such a topic, and that the current event had just brought it back to mind. Hopefully, Shinji wouldn't be too suspicious. The man had been evading their hunt for over a century now. If he smelled a trap he would bolt. He was cautious like that. Of course, now that he'd tagged her, Gabrielle had full memory of having sent him a letter which included the location of Shinji's hideout of her own initiative, since, having been such good friends so long ago, She trusted he wouldn't betray them and might even be willing to help them with their upcoming attack on Seoul society. And of course, as she had memory of having written it, he had memory of having read it, a memory that would remain even after his Shikai was no longer active, since unlike those of his targets, the alterations he made to his own memory were permanent. It was the cost for his power, but he'd learned to turn it into a benefit a long time ago. So, if all else failed, they could just attack him in his headquarters, although he'd rather not risk that against a prepared captain, especially with a Bankai of the type Shinji had. The current plan was a far safer way to go. Still, as he reflected on the situation, the lieutenant of the 11th Division couldn't help but worry. It had been almost 2 centuries now, since he'd transferred from the 2nd Division to the 11th, and while the whole point of the transfer had been to ensure that none of Kenpaku's crazy bunch stumbled on Las Noches before they were ready for it, he couldn't deny that the attitude of the others had rubbed on him considerably. He'd had to participate in hunts for hollows all across Hueco Mundo for decades, and while he'd made sure to only lead his teams to eliminate those hollows who weren't suitable for their plans, he'd still killed more of the creatures than most Shinigami ever met. Which was why he was so reluctant to use a plan that relied on a single hollow's powers so much. He had to agree, the idea of slipping an eye and ear the hollow had severed from his body so that they could observe and overhear while Gabrielle made her report to Hirako had been brilliant, as it ensured he could seal his Shikai as soon as the plan they'd carefully prepared for Shinji to follow was delivered without the man knowing, and since they would then be able to self-destruct and regenerate back into the hollow's body, it'd leave absolutely no trace. Still, it was a plan entirely depending on the hollow's loyalty. And while the others didn't doubt it, due to the hollow's apparent lack of emotional responses to anything, Tsukishima knew that no hollow was fully trustworthy. He had fought far too many of them to think otherwise. The Shinigami let out a long breath, then moved to where Rukia's little pawns were dealing with one of Tuan's Shinigami. He'd known this was likely to happen the moment he'd decided to send a hollow to attack in broad daylight in the middle of a crowd. That was the kind of thing that the members of divisions deployed to the mortal realm gave priority to. Still, there had been no other way to get Gabrielle properly spooked for the plan to work. And in a sense, having one of Tuan's rank-and-file people on the situation was a good thing, in case they had to deploy their backup plan. On the other hand, without tailing Rukia's team they'd never have found any of Shinji's people. They was far too useful an asset to discard at this point. And besides, too much attention to the group's operation too early could jeopardize the backup plan just as much as Grand Fisher killing Rukia's team would have. It was a tightrope to walk, and Tsukishima often wished that Jin was the one supervising the activities of Las Noches Hollows, instead of having had the duty dumped on himself, but of course, Jin was much too visible and his duties much too important for him to disappear from Seoul society for any long periods of time, whereas Tsukishima, as lieutenant of the 11th, had a ready-made excuse for long absences in the deserts and forests of Hueco Mundo, since monitoring those for hollow activity was his job, after all. The division of tasks made perfect sense, but that didn't make it any less of an hassle. With a sigh, he headed for the place where he'd left Rukia's little team, as he tried to decide how best to handle the situation without revealing his presence. A small smile formed on his face as he came up with something he thought might just work. While dealing with hollows was a pain, the opportunity to play mind games with people was the one thing that made this whole task worth it, well, in addition to the big payoff at the end. That, he really couldn't wait for. Sato watched as the Shinigami jumped down from the roof, landing in front of Tatsuki and pointing his sword at her as he said, "Well? Explain yourself. Who are you, what are you doing here, and what is it you have to salvage, exactly?" Sato watched as Tatsuki tried to collect herself to answer the guy, and frowned when he realized the questions were weird. As if the man hadn't had what they'd been said at all, except for the latest comment. After all, if he had, wouldn't he have asked after Rukia, or the cat? They'd mentioned both. Tatsuki seemed too surprised and worried to notice, however, as she sputtered back, indignation and anger quickly taking over. "What do you mean? I was just defending myself. Is that a crime now? That depends on why you're here. This is my area of competence, no other Shinigami should be here." "I'm not a Shinigami, I have no idea what you're talking about." Sato couldn't help but nod along at Tatsuki's bluster. It seemed she had figured out that this guy didn't know enough and playing dumb was the best move. But the Shinigami seemed only more incensed by that as he shouted. "Don't try and make a fool out of me, I could feel the hollow being defeated on my way here." "How did you achieve that, So that was the problem. The guy hadn't heard what they'd said, but he'd been able to feel what was going on with his Shinigami sense. Although, it seemed, not precisely enough to pinpoint what had actually happened in detail. Which made their next move pretty obvious, and Sato nodded to himself as he raised his hand. "That was me, actually." The Shinigami's head turned around to stare at him with disbelief, taking him in with a glance before shouting. "That's absurd, you're no Shinigami, you're a normal human. Fullbringer, actually. I destroyed the hollow after it attacked her." The Shinigami looked at him with clear disbelief, but before he could add anything more, his head whipped around as he said in disbelief. "Another one. What's going on today with all these hollows showing up out of nowhere in the middle of the day?" Then he turned back to the two of them and said, aiming his sword at Sato. "You two, wait here for me, I'll be back, and I'll want an explanation about this all." Then, he was off. Sato waited for him to leave, before gesturing to Tatsuki and saying, "Let's go, before he comes back." The girl nodded, and a moment later the two of them were rushing away as fast as they could. Still, Sato couldn't help but think the matter over in his head. Tatsuki eventually noticed as she asked, worried, "What's the matter?" That seemed strange. Far too convenient. A hollow showing up just at the right time to let us get away. And also at just the right time to let the Visored escape from our sight. Fuck. You're right, that sounds suspicious as hell. But, why would somebody help one of our enemies escape, and then let us escape as well? No idea. They continued to run in silence after that, worry etched on both their faces. Chapter 18, Doubts. "So, what do you all think about it?" Everybody looked clearly worried after Tatsuki finished her report, but eventually it was Rukia who broke the silence by saying, brows furrowed. "Well, it's hard to say for sure, but it certainly would suggest the involvement of a third party, wouldn't it?" "Not necessarily. It certainly suggests that somebody wants us to think of a third party in action, but that's what should make us actually suspect that's not what's going on here." Most everybody was looking puzzled at Yoriyuki's declaration. Seeing how thoughtful she looked, something easily noticeable in her cat form, Ichigo decided to prompt an explanation out of her. He'd learned during training that she wouldn't be forthcoming with it otherwise. For some reason, she really seemed to prefer doing all of her thinking by herself, although she'd easily explain whenever asked to. "It's not. Think of it, if we didn't have the second hollow showing up to save you, then we'd have naturally thought that the first was just another of the hollows that have allied themselves with Jinjo and Hirako, acting as a decoy for the member of their group to escape. But with the second one, appearing just in time to distract the Shinigami from pursuing you, it makes it seems like another, third party was trying to both help our enemy escape, and let you get away from a dangerous situation. Who would have anything to gain from that, and why would they do it? No, I think something different is going on here." "Like what?" "Like Hirako and Jinjo have lost control of some of the hollows that were helping them. Maybe they knew we were tailing them, but didn't want us to know, except that the hollow which attacked you did so by ignoring its orders, so they used one of the still obedient ones to make us think of a third party taking action." That made a weird sort of sense. It seemed less probable than simply a third party being involved, but then again, Ichigo wasn't a professional spy. He wasn't sure at which level of complexity was it more probable that something was enemy misdirection rather than third party meddling. Thus, he decided he might as well trust Yoroichi on the matter, instead deciding to ask what seemed to him the obvious question. "But why do something so convoluted, instead of just letting us be caught?" "Because they want us to keep following them, probably to lead us into a trap." "Do you truly believe that to be their intention?" Ichigo agreed with Ishida's doubt, but Yoriyuki seemed convinced of being correct on this point, as the thoughtfulness disappeared from the cat's muzzle as she nodded decisively. "Yes. It makes sense, and it would explain why, despite the fact they should be in high alert due to now knowing that we're tracking at least some of them, they've not changed their routines in any way that we could notice. They're trying to lure us in with a false sense of security. So, what, we just charge in to trigger it intentionally, so at least we're prepared." Tatsuki's comment caused Yoriyuki to direct one of her grins. As always, it was difficult to say whether it was meant to be encouraging or threatening. Cats just weren't made for that kind of expressions. I like the way you think, kid, but that never works in reality. No, what we need to do is find a way to turn what we know to be their weakness against them. They're trying to hide the fact they don't have full control over the hollows they're manipulating. We need to take advantage of them. And how do we do that? I have an idea. Ishida had been following in silence up until that point, so Ichigo was a bit surprised when he spoke. Judging by his serious, determined expression and the way his soul was resonating, Ichigo got the impression that he felt like it was necessary, rather than just wanting to join the conversation. Once everybody was looking at him, the archer continued, in the same tone. If they truly have so weak a leash on the hollows working for them, then perhaps a few hollow baits might help tip the balance and send those hollows into a frenzy. And no matter how well informed they might be, the array of items we Quincy use are such that they should be surprised by at least a few of those I could bring to bear. See, now that's more like it. While Yoriyuki was once more grinning in that disquieting manner of her, Urahara looked thoughtful as he asked her, absent-mindedly tapping on his desk with his fingers. But is that really enough of a plan to handle what they'll be throwing at us? The cat shrugged, apparently unconcerned. It's a start. What else would you suggest? We could ask the Fullbringers to help. Ishida speaking up, Ichigo had expected, but Chad he'd not, and his suggestion was weird enough that he got a lot of doubtful and perplexed looks. He didn't seem annoyed by them in any manner, however, and nor did he elaborate. Eventually, after giving his suggestion some serious consideration if how long the silence stretched was any indication, Yoroichi shook her head. That wouldn't work. If we let them go, they'd join our enemies, and tell them about our capabilities. It's way too big a risk for us to take. Ichigo wasn't that sure. Orium had seemed pretty sure that she'd be able to talk them around, and clearly Chad at least was convinced she had a shot, but Ishida and Rukia both nodded in agreement with Yoriyuki's point, so Ichigo decided to just let it go. Tatsuki, meanwhile, looked annoyed that all they'd managed to decide was that Ishida would provide them with some of his Quincy stuff, and kicked the leg of a nearby table before crossing her arms. Come on, there's gotta be something else we can do. How can we achieve anything if we don't put all of our effort into it? Ichigo tried to think of some way to calm Tatsuki down, something more proactive that they could do to solve the issue at hand. While her drive and determination were good qualities in themselves, Ichigo knew that his best friend could only muster her patience when actively working towards some goal, and waiting for their opponent to make a mistake, no matter how well prepared they might be by following Ishida's idea, had to rankle. He thought of it, but nothing seemed to come to mind. Their old plan was still the best bet they had, and that's when he realized why the old plan felt so unsatisfying right now, and how it could be made better and more proactive at the same time. Perhaps, we could try and provoke them before they're ready. Yoriyuki and Rukia both turned in his direction at that, but it was the latter who asked, sounding clearly curious. What do you mean? Well, the way I see it, they want to lead us on a trap. They're gonna pretend they don't know we're following us until their trap is ready, and then spring it on us, at which point we counteract it using Ishida's stuff. But, what if we attack them right now, before the trap is ready? Rukia frowned at the comment. How does that change anything? We wanted to wait to launch the attack because, if we went too early, we were worried Hirako would learn of us and ran away, right? But he learned of us anyway, and he's not running away, so what's the point in waiting any further? The longer we wait, the better their trap will become, the harder it becomes for us to win, so might as well just strike right now. Now that's more like it. Tatsuki slammed her fist in her palm with clear satisfaction at Ichigo's suggestion, but Ishida raised his hand as he interrupted. I'm gonna need at least 1 day to collect everything I can and perhaps prepare a few more, so the earlier we could attack would be tomorrow. Although, obviously, the later we attack, the more Jinto will I be able to prepare for us to use. Yeah, but you heard Ichigo, the more we wait the more time they get to prepare their ambush as well. Indeed, Tatsuki and Ichigo have a good point. The commanding tone in Yoriyuki's voice was enough to ensure silence from everyone, and she went on to explain. There's no real point in waiting anymore. If Hirako wanted to escape, he already would have. Clearly, He thinks that laying this trap is his best option right now. Perhaps he's hoping to capture one of us and force the captives to lead him to Soul Society, or maybe he just thinks that taking us all out will make it easier for him to disappear afterwards. Whatever the case, he clearly doesn't know I am here and thus thinks he can get a big win. He wants to force the confrontation. He won't run if we rush him into it. Let's strike tomorrow, and if we play it right, that'll be the end of this. Everybody nodded in agreement at that. Then Tatsuki shouted, almost vibrating with excitement. All right then, let's go tell Orium. I can't wait to show these guys what we're made of. Ichigo noticed that, while Chad was behind Tatsuki, Ishida seemed to be discussing something more with Urahara and Rukia. Yuriyuki had somehow already left. He let the three to it. Ishida was likely asking pointers on what of his Quincy weapons to bring along, and instead followed his friends downstairs, to the shop's basement which had been repurposed as the temporary new housing of the three Fullbringer they had caught. The room was relatively wide, comparable to a loft in size, with a door leading to a service bathroom at the end. There had already been a bed, but Urahara had added a sleeping couch, and a pair of hammocks had been hung in a corner of the space, while on the other was a dressing screen. There were also a larger dinner table and a smaller, round tea table, plus about 24 chairs, all wooden. Right now, Jackie was sitting at the larger table reading a book. Kiriko was napping on the couch, while Orium and Ririka were sitting on the bed and arguing, if Ichigo wasn't wrong, on who got to eat the last donut in the pack they were sharing. Ichigo couldn't help but chuckle when Tatsuki placed a hand on her forehead as she saw Orium making a pleading face at Ririka while the redhead tried to resist it and insist the last donut was hers. Orium? We should get going now, we're finished planning. That caused the girl to turn around with a big smile on her face. We have? So, have you managed to get the others to let Ririka and Jackie and Mr. Kiriko help? No, none of them trusts them. Ririka scoffed at that, turning a glare on the group as she said. And they're right to do so, make no mistake, we've not become friends just because I'm not actively trying to kill you all right now. Free me, and I'll fight you again if Jinjo asks me to. Orium puffed her cheeks in annoyance at that and said. Why must you be so stubborn, Ririka? You know hurting people is wrong, and your friend wants to hurt so many people. How can you not understand that? Ririka shook her head with a chuckle, patting Orium on the head. I might have decided not to hurt you, and out of respect for what you're trying to do, I would make Jinjo keep casualties to a minimum, but I'm not going to just betray him. But they're not going to let you out if you don't promise you won't fight anymore. Why can't you just promise not to hurt anybody anymore, like Jackie did? Jackie is lying. Orium turned to the dark-skinned woman with an expression of clear confusion and surprise on her face as she asked, in great worry. Jackie, you lied to me? The woman didn't raise her eyes from her book, merely turning the next page as she answered absent-mindedly. Of course not, I promised I wouldn't fight you again if you let me free because I meant it. Orium let out a relieved breath at that, although Ichigo's sensory ability made it clear to him that the woman didn't actually care about said promise. She didn't particularly want to fight them, but that had more to do with not wanting to be defeated another time than anything else. It was clear that, should Jinjo ask them to, each of the Fullbringers would be ready to fight for his cause again. Meanwhile, Orium continued to berate Ririka. So, you see, there's no need to be so mean. I'm just telling it to you how it is, Orium, there's nothing mean in being honest. There is if the things you are honest about hurt people. So I should just lie then, so people aren't hurt by my words. No. You should just stop thinking things that would hurt people if you said them out loud. Ichigo could already see that Orium was getting into one of her determined moods, and he knew from personal experience that she could outstubborn anyone when she got going. Tatsuki clearly agreed with the assessment, because she interrupted the argument quite quickly. There's no point arguing with them, Orium, they're not gonna change their minds. But Tatsu, you said you agreed with me that we should let them go. Tatsuki offered one of her smug smiles at that, placing her closed fists on her sides. That's because we'd just take them down again if we needed to. I beat their boss alone, you took down two by yourself, and Chad here knocked the other one out twice already, and we've all of their empowered items now. And we've gotten better this last week, while they couldn't practice at all. That's why I say to let them go, cause we can wipe the floor with them whenever we want to. Ririka glared at Tatsuki then, her previous argument with Orium completely forgotten as she growled out. You so sure about that? Why don't we have a run at it right here and now, just you and I, and see if you can put your money where your mouth is. Whenever and wherever you want to, I never tire of smacking down arrogant bullies like you. What I would like to know is, why are you so dedicated to following Jinjo? Ririka raised an eyebrow in surprise at Chad's question, something that Ichigo couldn't help but share into. He hadn't really considered the matter, but if he'd had, he wasn't sure he would have particularly cared about that. Knowing the guy had to be stopped was enough for him. But, clearly, not for Chad. For her own side, Ririka merely snorted, crossing her arms in annoyance as she shot back. You'd never understand. I might, if you explained it. Fine. Maybe then you lot will leave me alone. She got up, starting to pace back and forth as she explained. You see, Jinjo was a full-bringer since he was very young. He taught himself how to use the power from notes his father had left behind before escaping the country and abandoning Jinjo and his mother here, alone. She couldn't defend herself from hollows, so Jinjo did it for her. He had no reason to expect anybody else would do it for him if he didn't. That's how the world works, after all. That's so sad. More like so cynical, I'd say. Ririka ignored both Orium's teary expression and Tatsuki's annoyance, instead focusing completely on Chad's attentive face as she went on. One day, he was on his way home when he sensed a hollow attacking his mother. He used his powers to rush home to save her, but before he did, a Shinigami got in his way, stopped him and knocked him out, after saying that he wasn't authorized to hunt here, that killing hollows was something reserved only for Shinigami. Except when he came back to, he found that his mother had been killed, and there were no traces of either the hollow, the Shinigami, or even any fight between the two taking place. The redhead was clenching her fist in barely contained rage and disgust at her own tale. You understand, don't you? The Shinigami didn't actually care about saving anybody, he just wanted to protect his right to being the only one allowed to hunt hollow in the area, no, more like being the only one allowed to decide which hollows should be hunted at all, and which souls could be let to be devoured if a fight looked too dangerous, or just too much of a bother. That privilege is what we're fighting against. The Shinigami have no right to make such a decision for us. We should be able to defend ourselves however we choose to. And if we need to bring war to them to get ourselves that right, then yes, I'm gonna fight on Jinjo's side for it. Ririka looked ready to lash out at something, anything, after her tirade, but before she could, a crying Orium hugged her, sobbing about how sad her story was. Chad, however, merely nodded, apparently satisfied with having received the explanation. It was, Ichigo had to admit, as good a motivation as any to have a grudge with the Shinigami, but even so, Ichigo knew that, much as he could see how that would motivate Ririka, it wasn't what really motivated Jinjo. He'd fought the man, after all, and he'd seen the hatred in his eyes, and his disdain for the consequences that his actions would bring. He took a step forward, placing a hand on Orium's shoulder so that she let go of the redhead, then looked Ririka straight in the eye and said to her, in as serious a tone as he could muster. I won't deny that what happened to him was an injustice, and I understand wanting to fix one wrong, but that's not what Jinjo is fighting for. He might have been righteous when he started, but by now the only thing he cares about is to get revenge, and not one bit about how many will get hurt in his quest to get it. That's the truth, and I'm sure that you know it too. Then, he gestured for his friends to leave, and they all did, leaving the Fullbringers alone with their thoughts, while Ichigo himself couldn't help but think over the Ririka's story on his way out, in the wrong or not, knowing that Jinjo's hatred wasn't born from nothing left him unsettled. Perhaps it was due to being still thinking about the story that, when the following day Yuriyuki divided them in 3 teams, with Urahara remaining at the shop to keep an eye on the Fullbringers and the cat captain herself waiting in reserve, Ichigo asked to be partnered with Ishida. They were on their way to their target, the green-haired girl that Rukia's files had identified as Mashiro Kuna, when Ichigo finally decided to broach the topic, if nothing else to get it out of his mind before the fight. I never did ask you why you dislike Shinigami so much, did I? If Ishida was surprised, he didn't show it. His answer if nothing else was delivered in his usual pragmatic tone, giving away very little of what he was feeling, although Ichigo did sense that the Quincy's emotions had become a bit more guarded, and harder to read, upon hearing his question. It is hardly surprising, I made no mystery as to my reasons, after all. Yeah, but I get the feeling there's more to it than I know. You told me that Shinigami consider what Quincy do useless and dangerous, and that you're out to prove them wrong. When I asked Rukia for an explanation, she said that the remains of hollows that Quincy kill are left here instead of going to the Soul Society, and that makes it easier for powerful hollows to invade. That's correct, yes. Ishida was silent for a moment, then commented, sounding amused. When you ask a question like that, you make it sound like you doubt Kukaki's words on the matter. Ichigo frowned at Ishida's unusual attempt to be cagey on the topic. While he could understand him wanting to rib Ichigo a bit about the matter, he still needed an answer. He tried to find a way to reiterate his question without sounding too insistent or rude, but before he could, Ishida took it upon himself to continue the conversation. In any case, she didn't lie to you, that is correct. Why did you want to know? Because, if what she says is true, and the Quincy agree that it is, then why would Quincy still keep up their hunts? You're not that stupid, you know why. Ichigo let out an annoyed snort at that, but held back from shouting at Ishida, mostly because he was right. You want the right to defend yourself. Yes. And don't tell me you don't understand that, the very first time we spoke on this subject, you told me that you wanted to learn how to use the powers of a Shinigami to help protect those we care about. That's all that we Quincy want, too. And I understand that, but, it's not just about self-defense, is it? After all, you go on hunts, seeking the hollows yourself. That's different than simply wanting to know how to defend yourself if the need for it arises, isn't it? So it is. Do you have a point, Kurosaki? Sort of. I've been thinking, and the only way what you do makes sense is if you think that what the Shinigami do isn't enough. Ishida nodded at Ichigo's words, his expression hardening even as his feeling became even more guarded, and there was steel in his voice when he answered. That's because it isn't. Ichigo nodded, more to himself than to Ishida, but the Quincy was nevertheless quite surprised, probably because he thought Ichigo was agreeing with him, which he had never done before today. But that wasn't what Ichigo was nodding about. In a sense, he didn't want to reveal it, but in another, the argument would go nowhere if he didn't. So I was right, this isn't just about some greater purpose or cause, for you, this is personal. Somebody you cared about died because some Shinigami failed, and that's why you're so motivated about proving Shinigami wrong, about making it clear that Quincy are necessary. Ishida said nothing for a long time, but this time, Ichigo was content to wait. He'd made his point, and he knew it would sting and the archer would want to counter it. Which, sure enough, he did, although not in a manner Ichigo was expecting. What brought all this soul-searching about? I spoke with the Fullbringers, and knowing the reasons for their rage, I could see that your contempt wasn't all that different. I wanted to be sure. And now that you are, what happens? Are you worried I'll betray you all, since our motives are alike? Is that why you asked to be partnered with me, to keep an eye out for when I turn coat? Of course not, you're not going to betray us. Really? What makes you so sure? That's just not the type of person you are. Ichigo might not have spent as much time with Ishida as a number of the others had, but he's still seen plenty, and he'd heard more from both Orium and Rukia. Ishida might not be a warm person, but he was an honorable one, and most importantly, he saw himself as such. It wasn't hard to tell, he took pride in it, and it shone through in his every gesture and word even when he masked the emotion itself, which wasn't something he always remembered to do. The laugh startled Ichigo out of his thoughts, and he looked around for its source for a moment before making the connection that it was Ishida's. It was then he realized he'd never heard the other teen laugh before. It was a nice sound, although coming from the usually composed Quincy, it felt a bit weird, but it was also quite genuine. His senses confirmed it easily, but even without, he could have told he wasn't faking it. Ishida really was amused. Eventually, he composed himself enough to comment, amusement clear in his voice. You're really surprisingly naive, you know? But in a sense, such straightforwardness is refreshing. I can see what a new season you. Ichigo frowned at that. What do you mean? I mean that you could have used a number of logical reasons to justify your belief that I won't betray you, like the fact I had plenty of chance before and didn't, or that I was promised several rewards from both Rukia and her captain, or that Fullbringers are as much enemies of the Quincy as Shinigami are, or that we're ultimately fighting Hollows here so the common enemy would take precedence. But no, you went with an argument based entirely on your gut feelings and what you believe about my personality. I'm not used to being around people who think like that, is all. There wasn't much that Ichigo could reply to that, so he limited himself to shrugging and saying, "Well, that's just how I feel. You're an honorable type of person. I feel that if you disagreed with us and wanted to fight us, you'd just tell us outright and leave, not stab us in the back mid-battle." Ishida shook his head at that, in what Ichigo wasn't sure if it was a patronizing or merely amused fashion. That might be true, but to rely so much on gut feelings is. The Quincy trailed off, suddenly focusing, and Ichigo did as well. Their target was within their sensing range, and wasn't it nice that he could finally match Ishida's range on that particular field, so it was time to focus on her, rather than each other. Ishida obviously thought the same, as he was back to his more usual matter-of-fact tone when he spoke next. "I wanted to go over the stuff I handed out to you once more before the fight, but I got sidetracked by our conversation. Are you ready? You did that once already back before we left, and if I forget anything, I'll just improvise. It hasn't failed me so far. I hope you are correct about that. Don't worry about it. Come on, let's go." With that, Ichigo drew Sode no Shirayuki, but without releasing yet, and landed on the ground right in front of their target, while Ishida accelerated his energy sled to stop hovering just behind her. The girl eyes moved from one to the other of the two of them, and both her expression and emotions made it clear she wasn't surprised at all. Yoriyuki was right, they had been expecting this. She seemed to consider something for a moment, before focusing on Ichigo as she said, her tone surprisingly neutral. "So, I guess you got bored with just following us around, Must say, the captain didn't expect you to have roped the local Quincy in, but I guess in retrospect it makes sense that'd be how you found us." Ichigo let out a long breath before answering, trying to end this without violence even as he knew it wouldn't work. "Any chance of you surrendering to us and telling us where your boss is hiding? It could save us both a lot of trouble." The green-haired woman shook her head and then answered, in a mocking tone. "Nah, I think I'll make you work for it, if it's all the same to you. And besides, if you want to fight, you'll need to catch me first, won't you?" And with that, she was off, jumping into the air and starting to run even as she whispered something into something, likely a communicator of some type, like Yoroichi had given them all as well. Still, Ichigo realized that their opponent wasn't actually that fast. He could keep up with her without tiring himself, like he would have to with Rukia, which meant that Ishida was gaining on her very quickly. She seemed to notice that, but it didn't seem to worry her any as she said, "You know, the 3rd Division is something of the equivalent of what police forces are here in your mortal realm. Urban fighting is our specialty, and chases especially are one of the things we're the best at in all the Godii 13. Knowing your environment is the key there." And then, without warning, she dropped out of her Jigai, leaving it in Ishida's path even as she dove down. Ishida's reflexes were on par with his speed and he managed to avoid smashing into what looked for all things like a falling corpse now, but in doing so, he had to slow down and realign himself, and while he did that, Kuna had darted through a rooftop, moving inside a building only to a moment later escape from the side of it, continuing her escape while literally cutting through buildings, taking advantage of the fact she could phase through them at will. Ichigo darted after her, and soon was back on her tail, but while he was faster, she seemed to have better reflexes and be able to turn on a dime, using that to keep her advantage, or rather, he realized in a moment, she knew when she would need to turn ahead of time. This was a path she'd studied beforehand, specifically to be able to lead any pursuers into just such a chase. Ishida was keeping up high in the air, his higher speed allowing him to compensate for the necessity of stopping and reorienting himself whenever the Visored entered a building and changed direction inside it, thus forcing him to check to find her anytime. To make his life easier, Ichigo flared up his soul to be as powerful and attention-grabbing as it could be, which made the woman he was chasing let out an impressed whistle. "Wow, they sent a seated officer after poor little me? Man, I'm honored, really, you shouldn't have." Ichigo ignored the barb. He certainly wasn't about to explain his complicated situation to some girl he was going to be fighting with in a few moments, and instead simply shouted back, in as serious a tone as he could. "Does that means you're going to surrender now?" Not a chance, besides, we're almost there. Ichigo looked ahead, and saw that he'd been led to a large park, and indeed, he found that the others were arriving there too, having followed the two he identified as Gabrielle Burnous and Jerome Gibat, and when they landed, he saw that Hachigen Ushoda and Yukio were already there, clearly having been waiting for them and preparing the trap, if the large amount of glowing glyphs spread all over the grass were anything to go by. As she landed, Mashiro Kuna pointed at Ichigo and shouted, urgency entering her voice for the first time. Hachigen, this one is a seated OFFI sire. The man with the pink mustache nodded at that, and he started chanting something as he moved his hands, that caused Rukia's eyes to widen, and she shouted, sounding alarmed. Careful, that's a dimensional spell he's about to cast. They're gonna split us up. The fat man turned toward her and smiled as he said. Ah, from the 13th, are you? I was 2, before retiring to teach. And without a Zanpakuto yet, I see. I think I'll take you myself, then. And then, even as Rukia started to gesture, the man finished whatever he was doing, and suddenly, it seemed as if a crack was spreading through the sky. Ichigo went into a guard position, ready to take on whichever hollow would come out of it, but instead he was hit by a sudden sense of vertigo and headache that left him on his knees. It took him a few moments for him to get back to his feet, but he hurried to do so when he heard the sound of steps coming closer. He turned in the direction of the sound, and from one of the woods surrounding the area emerged a man wearing long black trousers and a white belt, a orange shirt with a black tie, and with a very recognizable face with a sharp chin, prominent teeth, small brown eyes, and blonde hairs arranged into a very unfashionable bob, shorter than in the pictures, but still a similar cut. Somehow, despite the discordant elements of it, the whole ensemble and look fit the man well, and in any case, that wasn't a face that anybody would fail to recognize after having seen it once, even if just in photograph. Ichigo offered his best self-assured grin to hide the nervousness within, because the man in front of him was no other than the one he'd been told in no uncertain terms not to fight, the former Godi I-13 captain, and now visored, Hirako Shinji. Chapter 19, Worth. As Ichigo glanced around, he realized that their surroundings looked somewhat off. They were still in the park, but it looked darker, as if somebody had placed a black filter over everything. Looking to the sky, he saw that it was a dark gray rather than blue, and the sun looked like a white disk, leaving off no actual light. Everything else seemed to be in penumbra, and there was no sound in the air. In fact, the air was also completely immobile, no wind to speak of, and when he looked at the grass at his feet, it was also standing immobile. And everybody else, except for him, had disappeared. The park, that had just moments before being full of people, was now completely empty. Except, that is, for one other person. Hirako Shinji was standing where he'd appeared, a perplexed expression on his face, and even as Ichigo noticed leaves frozen in midair behind him, the Shinigami spoke, confusion clear in his voice just as much as it was in his eyes. This is interesting. Getting back to his feet, Ichigo kept his smile on as he asked. What is the situation? You're dressed like a member of the 11th Division, and Mashiro said you're a seated officer, and you've certainly got the power to match one. I can feel that much myself. And yet, you don't really fit what I'd expect out of Aizen's subordinates, certainly not ones he'd trust to run this mission. No, I don't think he'd put somebody like you in charge. Maybe I'm not in charge of anything. How would you know? The man nodded, as if acknowledging the point. Indeed. And so, I'm left to think that you're the muscle of this expedition, here to smash things down as is the wont of your division, but somebody else is pulling the strings. There must be a plan afoot that I'm not following here. Ichigo shrugged at that, the movement hiding the fact that he was activating the communicator in his ear as he said. I don't know what you want me to say, I was just asked to help fighting your people, Hirako Shinji. If you want to know more than that, you'll need to ask those in charge. Will I? How else would you know, otherwise? Ichigo grinned, even as he waited for Yuriuki to show up. He'd sent the message, so now all he had to do was buy time, and if he could do it by chatting, he would. In fact, he was elated for a moment when Hirako didn't immediately answer, except that, as the silence stretched on, and nobody showed up, he started to wonder if he'd sent the signal wrong. He was about to try and figure a way to say Hiriko's name again without alerting his opponent to what he was trying to do when the man spoke again, his voice once more carrying that confused tone. "You're really the weirdest member of the 11th Division I've ever seen. Normally they'd consider it an insult to try and call for backup, but you were about to do it twice." Ichigo was surprised by that for a moment, but then decided to play it off as much as he could. "I've no idea what you're talking about." "Of course you do, and just so you know, you're a terrible liar. Not only can't you really hide the rising emotions in your soul when you lie, it even shows up on your face. In that, at least, you meets expectations." Ichigo didn't know how to answer to that, but it turned out he didn't need to, as the man went on, waving with his arm to include the entire area around them as he spoke. "We're neither in the mortal realm nor in the spiritual realm right now. By combining Haki's magic with young Yukio's power, we were capable of creating a set of overlapping pocket dimensions over this area. We didn't manage to make as many of them as we needed, or to incorporate most of the features meant to limit the ability of people to escape from them, since you sprung the attack on us so quickly, but even without those, no communication, spiritual or material, can get out of this place. For all intents and purposes, we're on a small little world whose only population is the two of us. Nobody is going to come save you here." "I see." Ichigo could feel the sweat on his palms and forehead, even as he waited with bated breath for Hiriko to attack. However, as the attack didn't come, he couldn't help but feel himself calming down just a bit. He was, after all, as ready as he could be, and it wasn't even the first time he'd faced a stronger opponent than himself. If anything, he was getting practice at that of late. And while he had little doubt that he was trapped here, he wasn't so sure they would manage to keep everybody else trapped too. Ishido was smart. They were underestimating Rukia because she didn't have her Zanpakuto, and he would bet that, between the two of them, one would find a way of getting him out and call Yuki. All he had to do was stay alive, and that was something he thought he could just manage. The moment his stance shifted to a more relaxed guard, as he reached his inner certainty and focused on being ready for whatever attack Hiriko would send his way, the man let out a long huff, placing a hand on his waist as he did. "And now you're not making sense again. You're not afraid anymore, but you're ready to fight defensively, instead of charging head-on. The attitude of somebody aiming to survive, not win." Ichigo couldn't manage to hide his surprise at that, alongside a small bark of laughter, and at seeing the put-upon look on the man's face, he couldn't help but comment. "Is that so strange? I was repeatedly told that I couldn't win against you, and even trying would be suicidal. What's so strange about being ready for that?" "See, that's the point. You're acting the way a smart person would. The average member of the 11th Division would see any declaration of something being suicidal as a challenge. Believe me, I know, I've been spending the last century in the company of one." "I see. And what do you make of that?" "I think that I'm starting to see how you might have caught Aizen's eye. Would I be wrong in thinking that you're not going to attack me unless I do it first?" Ichigo wasn't sure that admitting to it was a good idea, but he hadn't had much success with lying to the man so far, so he merely shrugged. "What does that changes?" "Well, if nothing else means you might just prefer talking to fighting. And there's a few things I'd like to talk about." "Like what?" "Like what Aizen's plans are, and what did he send you and your companions here for?" Ichigo was left honestly puzzled by that. He didn't think this was a secret at all, let alone a big enough one for Hiriko to want it explained to him. "We're here to defeat you, retrieve the Hujioku and give it back to him." Hiriko made a circular motion with his hand at that, sounding annoyed when he spoke again. Yes, that's obvious, but what about after? Once he has the Hujioku back in his hands, what's he gonna do with it? What's the master plan, the ultimate goal? What's he gonna use it for? I have no idea what you're talking about. You're the one who stole it, we are just to help him put it back wherever it was. Or use it for whatever it was being used for before, I guess. Spiritual technology isn't really something I understand particularly well." Hiriko frowned at that, clearly displeased with the answer. "I'm not looking for whatever tripe he's gonna feed the higher-ups of Soul Society, I'm asking about the true goal. Yukio described to me the other person there when he was interrogated, and if he has his lackey Urahara here running the show, then this is obviously not an officially sanctioned Godi I-13 operation. So there's no need to try and keep this charade up. We all know he has plans to use the Hujioka for himself. That's why he had Urahara frame me, because he didn't want me to reveal what I discovered about his illicit activities. So, how about one of you tell me the truth for once? Ichigo listened to the tirade with a certain awe. Aizen did warn them all that Hirako had tried to pretend himself as being framed by Aizen to get Jinjo's help, but he hadn't expected the man to try and use the same trick to make Ichigo change sides so blatantly. If that was even his goal, Ichigo couldn't think of another, but it wasn't like he was good at this spy and counter-spy business. Still, he could at least answer honestly this time, so he managed to call up a truly amused smile as he did. The only truth I know is that he's going to return the Hujioka to its place, where you stole it from. I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but it's not gonna work. Hirako's expression shifted for a moment to genuinely impressed, before going back to annoyed. I see. So either you're honest and know nothing, or you got good at lying all of a sudden. Or, most likely, the third option. Ichigo couldn't help but be curious about that. Which would be? You were pretending to be bad at lying until now, to pull this whole thing off, or maybe to keep up plausible deniability in case I was planning on recording a confession to use against Aizen. Ichigo hadn't thought about that, but that did put Hirako's whole speech in a different light. Maybe he was trying to get something he could use to make his pretense of having been framed more believable in some manner. Is that what you were doing? Hirako shook his head at that, and turned very serious all of a sudden. All right, I have a new plan. I'll just beat the truth out of you. If you're not lying, I'm sure I'll be able to find out at some point, or you can yield and tell me everything at any time if you want me to stop, of course. Assuming you'd still be capable of speaking at that point, that is. Ichigo grit his teeth, but he'd banished all of his nervousness by now, so instead he merely grinned as he raised his sword to a guard position once again and answered. Then we'll just need to see, won't we? Dance, Sode no Shirayuki. As Ichigo's Zanpakuto changed to its released form, Hirako twirled his hand as he had a number of times, except this time, a katana seemed to almost appear from nowhere straight into his hand. Ichigo couldn't say how he'd drawn or, indeed, even if he'd been carrying it at all, even though clearly he must have. For his own, Hirako offered an amused smile to Ichigo, raising his blade as he did. Let's dance then, I'm curious to see what your Shikai can do. And then, the man was charging, and Ichigo could immediately tell that the captain's Shunpo was superior to his own. He only needed 3 steps to cover a distance Ichigo would have needed twice that for, which meant he only barely managed to deflect the blade going for his neck with the tip of his own. He was left unbalanced as a result, and the parry for the follow-up thrust would have sent him crashing to the ground, if he hadn't expected the strength behind it to be huge, despite how thin his opponent looked like. However, expecting it made all the difference, as he managed to use Hakuta to make a flow of Ryotsu around his body act like water, causing him to slide away instead of being smashed down. Thus, Hirako's strike to where his body would otherwise have been hit nothing, while he quickly switched from the water-like relaxation to rock-like determination to stop his slide and get back to his feet faster than he would have been able to relying on physical skill alone. Hirako raised an eyebrow as he saw this, standing still rather than pressing him on, instead commenting, as he tapped his sword to his shoes in a thoughtful manner. Integrating Hakuta with swordplay is also highly uncharacteristic of members of the hunting division. I would have expected pure Zanjutsu there. You're really one odd duck. Am I now? Hirako seemed to consider that, and Ichigo took the time to catch a bit of his breath, before eventually his opponent let out a long, annoyed breath. No, of course not, I'm a moron. You're not really of the 11th, you're just wearing their uniform. Honestly, I should have expected Aizen to stoop so low as to come up with a false flag operation. Where do you come from truly, boy? Does it matter? I suppose not, it'll be just another thing I'll need to beat out of you in the end. And then, the man charged again. This time, however, as Ichigo managed to parry his opponent's next strike, he pushed out with Sode no Shirayuki's power right at the point of impact, locking both blades together on a single block of ice. He didn't expect it to hold and, indeed, Hirako ripped his sword free from the ice in an explosion of ice shards, but Ichigo meanwhile had thrown the fastest punch he could, making it lighter with Ho-Ho even as he hardened the fist into rock-hard determination. Only to almost feel like his hand cracked the moment it impacted Hirako's abdomen, as if he'd smashed it on steel. He quickly jumped backwards, avoiding Hiriko's slash at his legs, while the man looked down at him and said, "You know, the reason why so many captains look so stoic and why keeping your emotions under control is considered among the greatest points of pride for a Shinigami is that, from an Hakuta perspective, the way that tight emotional insulation results into steel-like Ryotsu makes it probably the most versatile emotional state to cultivate. It's very useful for both offense and defense, and if you keep it up as your general attitude most of the time, you're somewhat protected by surprise attacks, to a small degree. I don't think you're good enough at Hakuta to achieve that, though, are you?" This time, the man didn't wait for Ichigo to answer. Instead, charging again, Ichigo stepped backward once again, and kept doing so as he parried 3 consecutive slashes from his opponent, each time unable to mount a counter-attack because Hiriko was just too fast, the recovery time between each of his attacks too short for Ichigo to exploit it in any manner. Hoping to change the pattern, Ichigo decided to go for a hard block for the first time since the beginning of the battle, but just as he'd expected, the enemy's sword slammed into his so hard he was sent flying backwards by the strength of the impact. He used Ho-Ho to quickly gain some foothold in midair, but Hiriko didn't even look surprised at seeing him walk on air, merely doing the same as he darted toward Ichigo again. Ichigo knew that just dodging wouldn't lead anywhere. Against a superior opponent like the Captain Clearly Way, that would just lead to him being pushed backwards again and again until his enemy had him cornered. He would need to try something different, and he did have an idea that just might work. He called upon Sode no Shirayuki, and then sent his Ryotsu to cover the blade, the Zanpakuto allowing it to happen, so that when he blocked Hiriko's attack this time, it was with a sword wrapped into several layers of a rock-hard cover as he focused all of his determination into it, the sheer weight and sturdiness of the sword enough to cause it to actually stop Hiriko's attack, rather than being pushed back by it. The Shinigami captain was actually surprised by the maneuver for a fraction of a second, and Ichigo tried to capitalize on it, letting his makeshift reinforcing go to strike as fast as he could. Hiriko dodged backwards, but Ichigo had expected that and extended his reach with Ho-Ho as he struck, the blade managing to puncture Hiriko's upper torso, although the wound was clearly barely above a scratch, not even bleeding. Still, the man moved his hand to it in surprise, and Ichigo pressed forward, but this time his opponent was expecting the strike and slashed horizontally in response with enough force to push Ichigo backwards once again. Then he said, sounding puzzled, "That was weird. Creative, I admit, never before seen somebody try to use Hakuta on their weapon, but it'd have been much easier to do with Zanjutsu. In fact, you really haven't been using Zanjutsu much at all." Ichigo had no idea what the other man was talking about, but seeing as every time he'd let him speak, he'd then put him on the back foot immediately afterwards with his follow-up attacks, Ichigo didn't wait to hear him conclude his speech, instead charging forward at him. Hiriko went into a guard position, but Ichigo didn't actually strike at him, instead stopping earlier and slashing his sword multiple times, creating a number of thin but sharp discs of ice suspended in midair before sending them flying onward with a repulsive push of his Ryotsu. As he'd expected, his enemy dodged in face of so many attacks rather than trying to stop them, thus moving directly into the path of Ichigo's strike as he repositioned to the side, taking advantage of the blind spot that his avalanche of ice blades had created. Even with the advantage of such a surprise strike, however, Hiriko was ready to parry, but this time, Ichigo pushed Sode no Shirayuki's power out with purpose, a thin line of frost slithering along the entire length of the blade, from the point of contact to the handle all the way past the hilt and the crossguard, which, as he'd hoped for, caused the Zanpakuto to slip from the hand of a surprised Hiriko as the grip he'd been holding suddenly turned into a smooth ice surface. Having been expecting the move, Ichigo slashed backwards, and while Hiriko managed to dodge most of the blow, and Ichigo could see the resistance as the man also used Hakuta and Ho-Ho both to slow the strike down and make it hit far less deeply, he nevertheless came away from the exchange having opened a line of blood over the man's face. He couldn't help the grin that formed there. He'd been told again and again that he wouldn't be able to beat this man, but he'd managed to bleed him twice already, and he was still unwounded so far. He could do this. Hiriko seemed ready to speak, but Ichigo didn't want to let him, charging ahead once more. Except suddenly, he felt his body slowing down, as if he was trying to run through muddy water. He could feel his breath being stolen, and it took all of his effort to avoid completely losing control of his body and falling to the ground. He could still move, but the pressure was unlike any he'd faced before. perhaps 4 or even 5 times greater than what Rukia had used against him. And he'd completely forgotten about it. He wasn't crippled by it, indeed, he could feel himself adapting, but he could see that moving at the same speed and striking with the same strength he was using before would be much more tiring now, and regardless, the sudden shock and surprise of this trick being deployed against him had given Hirako what he needed. The man had darted away, his speed having apparently not being hampered in the last by releasing so much Ryotsu at once, and he'd used it to recover his sword, the ice on which he seemed to be melting with pure rage. Despite the Ryotsu in his hands being visibly smoking hot, when he spoke to Ichigo it was with an almost chilling and very serious tone. It didn't sounded annoyed, rather quite patronizing. "So, I was right. You have a good Shikai that you know how to use creatively. I'd probably rank you as skilled in both Hakuta and Hoho, and you've a knack for combining them all together that can be genuinely surprising, but you're only halfway there in Zanjutsu. You've got a good rapport with U-Sword, of course, and even some sort of working relationship established, but you've never used any of the technical aspects of it at all, even when I left you clear openings to do it. Which means you can't." Ichigo couldn't help but frown at that. He knew he was being taunted into doing something stupid, so he was careful to keep control of himself, but he couldn't help but feel annoyed at the tone the man was using, but more than that, the way this man kept commenting on his performance like this was some sort of test felt really out of place. "Why do you care? You keep nattering about my abilities and how good I am and whatever else, but I don't see how that helps you, or why you would want me to know what you're thinking. What's the point?" "Oh, there is no point, I just enjoy commenting my fights, it makes them more amusing." "Right, like I'm gonna believe that." "You won't?" "Ah, well, perhaps you might believe that I'm doing it so that you know this whole thing isn't serious at all to me. Because I want you to understand that to me, this is no different than giving an evaluation to a demonstration from one of my students. This thing we're having is no fight, it's barely even a lesson." Ichigo's frown grew deeper, as did his annoyance, but knowing this was just what the man wanted, to goad him into a mistake, he bit back his first retort and instead tried to make his answer sound as if he couldn't care less about Hirako's declaration. "Aren't you supposed to teach things in a lesson? I feel like you are not doing your job right here." It seemed that he'd managed to strike a nerve with that comment, as Hirako's eyes narrowed at that. "I suppose I should teach you a lesson then. How about Zanjutsu, since you're so pathetic at it?" Then Hirako turned his sword at an angle, and suddenly, it almost seemed to catch all of Ichigo's attention. He could almost feel as if the sword was more real than everything else around it. Then Hirako moved, and Ichigo prepared himself to block just as he had before, when Sode no Shirayuki's voice suddenly exploded in his head with a warning to dodge. Instead, he did, almost reactively letting his Hoho go and falling as the sword cut where he was. As Hirako turned toward him, Ichigo slashed to create a few blades of ice and sending them at the man, except this time, instead of dodging, the man just slashed, and instead of exploding the way the ice always had when anything hit it, the sword even sliced cleanly through them all in a single movement, without even losing speed, and when Ichigo landed and darted backwards, putting a large boulder between them, Hirako once more sliced straight through it, once again seeming to need to put no effort at all behind the strike to achieve such cutting power. Ichigo watched the sword with a sense of growing fear. He wouldn't be able to block or even parry any longer against it now. Hirako seemed to understand what Ichigo was thinking, as he nodded and said, "Serious. Zanjutsu isn't just about using the wisdom of your sword to bolster your own, or having it help you as a companion in battle. The connection is also meant to make you and the sword operate as a single being. You can feed power to the sword, which makes it more dense, and thus able to be much more powerful. And, of course, you can draw power from it as well, to make yourself stronger as well, or help you recover faster, by filling the wound left in your missing soul with pieces of your sword's soul." Even as he explained, the light cut Ichigo had left on Hirako's cheek slowly disappeared, clearly healing itself in exactly the way the man was explaining. He said nothing, as if wanting the show of power speak for itself, before adding, "Of course, to do that right you really need to have mastered Zanjutsu properly, since otherwise you risk the sword's soul overtaking or contaminating your own, which hurts rather than helping. But you're so creative, so I'm sure you can figure it out on your own, right?" Ichigo could feel himself sweating again as Hirako raised his sword and prepared to strike again as he concluded. "Because if you cannot, then I think this set excuse for a battle is gonna be over soon, and we can start the part where you answer my questions. Ichigo swallowed as he prepared himself, feeling his emotions churning in an uneasy vortex within his soul. He was getting the sense that this battle was about to get far more serious. Chad was surprised when the word warped around him. He could feel it happening, as the air he'd been pushing his emotions into suddenly disappeared to be replaced by air that somehow felt different, and he lost his footing for a moment before he focused on it again and once more managed to persuade the air to support his weight. Even as the air yielded to his request, the sheer strength of the emotion he could infuse his Ryotsu with as inhuman, vastly larger than the air's own unwillingness to change. Chad sensed a level of resistance that was new to him. Even as he slowly moved himself to land, he tried to understand what it was that made it feel so different. He'd found that understanding the world and feelings of those around himself really helped in figuring out how to channel his own emotions, and after a moment, he understood what was different about it. Whereas the normal air was always carrying some slightest traces of soul particles within it, this one looked almost completely devoid of it, as if no soul had been here before to leave residual of their soul behind. He wondered how such a place came to be, but then his attention was caught when he realized that, despite everybody having disappeared when the whole place shifted, he wasn't alone. He could feel a powerful presence in the area, although currently hiding in the woods. Once he had his feet solidly on the ground, he turned in the direction of the hiding person, trying to see if he could determine something more about them by letting out a pulse of Ryotsu as Ichigo had taught him. Since learning what Fullbring was about, he'd started to experiment with the ability. He could imprint it with some urgency to make it move faster and thus rebound the information back more quickly, or make it harder to detect by making the pulse more focused. In this case, however, he didn't even need to do it, as once he kept his attention on the hidden person for a few seconds while he considered what to do, he heard a sigh coming from the area, followed by a very annoyed female voice commenting, sounding clearly annoyed. I knew this whole ambush thing was a dumb idea, and that we weren't about to surprise anyone. Should have just gone with the charging at you plan Gab suggested, it'd have been quicker. The speaker emerged from the trees then, revealing herself to be a short, young girl wearing a red jogging suit over a white shirt, with blonde hairs styled in pigtails and a katana in hand that she kept tapping the flat of over her own shoulder in an annoyed manner, which matched one of the description they had been given of the visored. You are Hiyori Saragaki? Yes. I know who I am, no need to tell me. Who are you instead, big guy? Chad didn't see how knowing his name would help her, since she had no way to know who he was, but he couldn't see any reason not to be polite in return for her question. Yasutara Sato. I don't think the name means much to you. She scoffed at that. That's not the point. When you fight somebody who's not in Hollow, you must learn their name. That's just how we do things in the 11th. Chad took a moment to absorb that. None of the Shinigami had mentioned to him that the different divisions their army was organized into had special traditions. He'd thought they only were separated because they sought a different task, but he supposed he could see how a group of people who worked together could form rituals to emphasize the group cohesion. Even understanding that, however, such politeness seemed like a strange tradition for a group of warriors to develop. Does your leader especially values politeness? What? That's not the point at all. It's just that, should you lose to somebody, you need to know who they are so you can beat them later once you've got better. It's a matter of pride. And if you win, like you should, then remembering their names is the only way to properly honor those who gave you a good fight before you killed them. Killed? So you mean for this to be a fight to the death? If the way she stomped her sandaled feet to the ground and narrowing her eyes into a deadly glare aimed at him was any indication, Hiyori had felt very offended by that, which the rage in her tone seemed to confirm. Of course. When you get into a fight, you need to give it your all, else it's no fight at all. If you hold back to avoid killing your opponent, what's even the point of fighting in the first place? You might as well just go have a spar instead, at least that wouldn't be a waste of your time. I see. You're nothing like I expected. The way the three Shinigami had painted Hiriko's action, he'd infected the people under his command with hollows to control them by controlling the hollows they'd been infected by. According to Yuriuki in particular, who had been the one to single-handedly subdue them all the first time and had also fight their leader, the subordinates had become ferocious monsters attacking indiscriminately, their hollows directing their every action, while Hiriko himself had been in full control of the powers the hollow had granted him. Upon seeing the way those of them which they had stalked were interacting with people, the cat Shinigami had suggested that Hirako had either put the hollows in charge and the monster were just pretending to be humans, or else that he was blackmailing his former subordinates in obeying him by threatening them with releasing the hollow inside of them if they disobeyed. But if either of those had been the case, then this girl should have either charged at him already, or be reluctant to fight somewhat, and yet, she was neither. It was really out of what Chad's expectation for confronting the Vizard had been. The girl herself, however, seemed to think that his expectations had been found wanting for other reasons, apparently finding that, too, quite annoying. "What, you thought I'd just go easy on you like Shinji and his minions always do? Because I'm not one of them, and really, the way they act is silly. I mean, holding back, fighting to capture rather than kill, and always limit the use of force to the minimum you think necessary is no way to fight. That's barely even sparring, that's just playing. I mean, I guess I can see why they'd act like that. His 3rd Division is in charge of keeping order in the Rokanga, and when all you have to deal with is rambunctious commoners, I suppose it makes sense to go at it with kids' gloves, but that's just the thing, isn't it? We aren't in the Rokanga fighting civilians here, yet those idiots don't seem to get it into their thick heads that we need to be hard to survive. But then again, I don't know why I'd expect anything else from them. The 3rd is probably the 2nd most pansiest division ever after the 4th, and those at least have the excuse of having a badass captain who can outfight anything alone, so there's really no need for them to learn how to fight, and I suppose weaklings do need a place to go to as well. But the 3rd's captain is Shinji, which is just shameful, really. They're an insult to every Shinigami out there. Let me tell you, having to live with them is a terrible pain in the ass." The way the girl had spoken those last words, with a certain extent of fondness, made Chad believe that she was just putting up a though persona to hide the fact she actually cared a lot about her companions, which really clashed with the idea of what he had expected these people to be like. What's more, the long rant she'd went on made it clear it wasn't at him she was annoyed, but rather in Hirako himself. Except that the way she'd expressed that annoyance wasn't at all what he'd have expected of somebody being blackmailed and complaining about the blackmailer. The whole thing felt quite weird to Chad, but he could hardly ask the girl about it, seeing as she was finishing her rant, having now shifted to what sounded like a prideful boast. But in the end, Shinji's not my captain. I don't actually take orders from him, just follows his suggestions when they make sense. Which is most of the time, because pansy as he is a captain after all, but he's not mine, and on fighting, I follow the example of one man only, and on this, I know best than Shinji does. I'm from the 11th, and whenever I fight to the death. She then raised her Zanpakuto above her head with both hands, shouting as loud as she could. So I hope you'll give me a worthy fight, Yasutara Sato, now chop away, Kyubikari Orakai. For a moment, the sword was surrounded by what looked like 5 gigantic snakes made of green energy, which then exploded into a flash of light. When they disappeared, the sword had transformed into a huge cleaver with a serrated saw-like blade, yet she seemed to easily wield it with one hand as she grinned in a very menacing manner, pointing a finger at him as she said, "Now come on, big guy, let's go all out." And then, without even a pause, in fact, actually starting the movement before she'd even finished speaking, probably in an effort to catch him by surprise, Hiyori darted forward. Chad didn't even try to wait and stop the attack, instead jumping backwards. The ground was more responsive than the air to full-bring manipulations, and that remained true even in this place. In fact, the difference seemed even more pronounced to him. That meant he managed to dodge out of Hiyori's downward slash despite how fast it was, and as the air rippled from the sheer power of the sword, he could feel a sort of feedback loop as the air the sword had displaced interacted with his own Ryutsu. In fact, while the air couldn't really carry real emotions, the way it sped up as it raced away from the blade almost made it feel like the weapon scared it. Which just increased Chad's unwillingness to even come close to it. He admitted to himself that this would make the fight harder for him. So far, he'd often banked on his ability to take a hit or two when fighting hollows or the other full-bringers, delivering surprise knockouts after resisting a hit they'd thought would take him down, but doing the same this time was too risky. And that meant that, much as he didn't want to risk it, he would have to try using a number of tricks that he'd only guessed should work based on what Orium told her of her fight with Ririka, but he'd not tried yet. Still, as he saw Hiyori using the Shinigami's air walking to use her large sword as the pivot for a spun forward, somehow managing to add the momentum of their first strike into the second. Chad could see that she'd just continue to keep the attack in this manner if he kept retreating, so he dodged by unleashing his Ryotsu from the side, turning the air elastic and using it to push himself to the side. Then he struck back, once more reaching to the air as he did, but this time to instead force it to give way to his punch faster than it otherwise would, removing all attrition from it and thus causing his fist to be delivered with a speed that surprised even him. It certainly caught Hiyori by surprise, sending her flying back with a huge bruise on her face. The girl grinned, apparently undaunted by it, even as she cleared a small trickle of blood with the back of her hand. Now that was not something I've seen before. What sort of trick was it? She didn't seem to really care about the answer, as she charged back in as she spoke, and this time she attacked with a series of horizontal slashes, clearly meant to stop Chad from repeating his previous side dodge and force him to keep moving backwards. He also noticed that she didn't bother to reverse the grip on her sword between swings, so that half of those were made with the dull backside of it, and yet, as the air moved by each slash bounced against his skin, he could almost feel the sharpness of the blade from the effect it had had on it, and Chad couldn't doubt that either side would cut just as well as the other one. The bigger problem was that, by striking like this, combined with Hiyori's own speed, Chad couldn't interject an attack of his own in between hers, so, instead he used his power to jump upwards, something she'd clearly anticipated, as she started an upwards strike as soon as she saw him rising upwards, but he didn't let that deter him, instead reaching to the air in front of himself to have it condense for a moment as he snapped a kick out, turning it into a straight-up heavy projectile that slammed straight into Hiyori's face, even as he made the air behind himself give way more easily once more, resulting in him being propelled away from his opponent even as she was smashed into the ground by his attack. To her credit, despite clearly looking surprised at his strike, Hiyori rolled with the hit surprisingly well, getting back onto her feet before he'd even finished his own backward movement, and charging forward with another of her shouts of joy. "So, you've air powers?" "Haven't fought any of those in a while, but I remember how to handle it just fine." Said handling being, Chad surmised, to keep him in close quarters, instead of going into a pattern of attack mean to force him back. She started with a vertical slash clearly meant to force him to repeat his side dodge, and then went into a sweeping kick at chest height obviously aimed to send him crashing into the sword. He made the air offer resistance to her kick, bouncing it back, but then had to duck when she punched at his head and a blast of fire erupted from her hand. Clearly this was what she'd wanted as she stuck with the sword and kick again, apparently having no trouble balancing in midair on just one leg. The reach of the sword was such that he couldn't just dodge backward, and any movement upwards would obviously result into heading straight into a fireball, so he took what seemed like the least dangerous path, moving toward the kick. Once again, he put a barrier of air to make it bounce back as he'd done before, except this time, her leg cut straight through it as if it wasn't there. That surprised him, so he went for the only defense he could put up in time, raising his arm and channeling emotions into his pendant to create the gauntlet over it, as well as filling it with as much Ryotsu as possible to make it even tougher. The kick was probably the hardest hit Chad had ever been hit for. The combination of gauntlet and armor dispersed most of it, but even so the attack cut through, leaving a long line of blood over his forearm, and he could feel the sword closing on him on the other side. In desperation, he poured as much Ryotsu as he could straight upward, forcing the air to not just let him through, but actually drag him upwards. The movement was so fast that was surprised by the push and released it almost subconsciously, luckily after he was out of the trap, and the return of the air to its previous state was so sudden that it caused a sudden explosion of wind straight in front of Hiyori, sending her plummeting to the ground. As he found himself falling, Chad slowed his descent as usual, but also frowned as he saw Hiyori once again recovering from her fall relatively quickly. Trying another experiment, he pushed Ryotsu as far as he could straight out of his air to make the air in front of himself clearer of as much impurity as possible, and confirmed what he'd thought. Hiyori was healing, the small wounds left on her from their clash slowly disappearing from her form. It was, Chad noticed, not a very fast regeneration, certainly nowhere near what a hollow could sport, and he'd overpowered that before, but not with a series of sequential small strikes. If he wanted to win this, what was necessary was a single, powerful knockout strike. Luckily, he did have one of those. Thus, when Hiyori seemed to be deciding how to next change her attack strategy as she finished getting back up to her feet, Chad once more channeled his strongest emotions into his awakened item, and fired a beam of energy straight at the blonde girl, with as much power behind it as he could. She blinked, but then, instead of trying to dodge, not that she would have had the time, she just rushed to slash her sword in front of herself, the beam slamming into the sword with all of its power, and exploding into a multitude of glittering sparkles of energy that fell like some sort of radioactive rain around the Shinigami, while she grinned up at him. Surprised, It almost seems like you've never seen a Shikai in action before. While that wasn't true, Chad had to admit that whatever his opponent had done here looked quite different from Ichigo's ice ability, but even that one, he realized, had been able to affect his attack. He really should have expected it, although it was hard to make prediction over something he didn't know. Thus, trying to understand what was going on was, he thought, the best option. I have seen a Shikai before, but it simply creates ice. What you did was different. That caused Hiyori to actually almost preen as she ran a hand over her sword and said, "See, that's what everybody thinks. Of the 3 types of Zanpakuto, the elemental types get all the attention because they're more flashy. And, sure, they're better for crowd control, I'll give you that, but anybody who needs crowd control is just a weakling who's either too slow to dodge attacks, or not though enough to take a couple. Then there's mind types, those look awesome and unbeatable when the user's in control, but really, they all rely on tricks and mind games and plotting and plans, and the moment you make a mistake and the enemy sees through it, you're done for. They're for pansies like Shinji or eggheads like the 12th and 13th, but every real warrior knows that the best Zanpakuto are the transformation type. And your sword is one of those. Yup. See, transformation type all have very simple effects. They either turn themselves, the user or something they touch into something. It's straightforward, reliable, and it really doesn't matter if your enemy knows the power or not, because there's no real counter, it's just a matter of the user's skill, to apply what they have the right way, but since it's just the one ability, you get to really train with it. And Kubikuri Orokai is one of the best even among transformation types. See, anything it touches, regardless of how, it breaks. I only need one successful blow, and any hollow I'm facing will fall down to pieces in front of me, as will anything else. Including, as you just see, constructs of Ryutsu, or Kido, or whatever, no cage can contain it, and so long as I can help it land one hit, we win. Hiyori tapped her sword to the ground, causing a sudden web of cracks to form around her for several meters, then smirked in self-satisfaction as she said, "I hope that didn't scare you too much. I was enjoying our bout so far. I'd hate for you to chicken out on me now that you've realized how strong I really am. I never had any intention of letting your sword hit me in the first place." "Good, then let's get back to it." And to punctuate the point, she slammed her feet on the ground, provoking an explosion as she did, which she then leveraged into sending a large lump of soil straight at him. Chad frowned. The propensity of people who performed spiritual combat for throwing around pieces of their surroundings as weapons was weird. Still, he supposed he could take advantage of it. He focused, sending out a pulse of Ryutsu as thin and sharp as possible, which went through the soil, confirming that it was mostly kept together by grass roots and thus not actually that sturdy at all, to locate the angle of approach Hiyori was taking. Once he knew that, he once more awakened his item, but this time held onto it instead of sending it away, and then focused on the Ryutsu surrounding his skin. He changed it from what it was currently doing, making his skin tougher, to instead try another thing he could only hope would work. As the soil slammed into his body, he let the Ryutsu around himself ask it to not stick to him in any way, instead causing the earth particles to flow around him as if they were water. As a result, he emerged from it right in front of a completely surprised Hiyori, since his movement through the obstacle had not given any sign, and since he'd made sure to do it with his first straight in front of her, she had no way to dodge or interpose her sword as he fired his energy beam at point-blank range. Chad could see trails of blood coming from Hiyori as she fell to the ground, and he charged after her, repeatedly turning the air into a set of trampolines to accelerate himself toward her as he prepared a finishing blow. However, as he cleared his sight to make sure he didn't miss her, he saw her running a hand over her own face, and when she removed it, where had been her face was now a mask. It was unmistakably a hollow's mask, white and with a jutting chin, huge teeth that took over about half of the face, and a prominent horn sprouting out of her forehead in between eyebrows that were actually a set of purple diamond-shaped markings over each eye socket. Chad also noticed that the sclera around her brown iris had turned completely black, but most important of all, a good deal of her wounds disappeared entirely, regenerating at a truly astonishing, yet incredibly familiar pace, the pace a hollow would recover at. Chad stopped his charge as the girl slammed into the ground with only a feet, yet instead of breaking it, she created a large crater from the strength of the impact, the soil clearly no match for the strength she now possessed, and Chad did notice that, even as she'd landed, she'd kept her sword aimed upwards so that, even if he'd not stopped, any approach would still have required him to slow down and maneuver anyway. Once she had back her footing, the girl ran a hand over her face, causing the mask to disappear, and appearing not particularly shaken by it. Indeed, she seemed to be fully in control of herself, not had she seemed to lose any control while she had the mask on. She was much less wounded, although even the faster regeneration she had sported had not healed the entirety of the damage Chad's beam had inflicted, which was weird. If she could heal so quickly, why not keep the mask up for a bit more, and heal herself completely? In fact, seeing as the mask seemed to augment her strength as well, why not keep it up for the entire battle, especially when she'd said she wanted to fight with all of power and with full intent of killing him? There was really only one possible answer to that. You can only keep control of the hollow inside yourself for a short amount of time. And you're clearly pretty observant. Are we stating the obvious now? I thought we were fighting. I was just wondering how your hollow powers work, and why they have a time limit. That's because the hollow trapped inside of me is by far the strongest of them all, and thus it's hard to keep it contained. They're not fluffy and friendly, you know? They're always striving to take over, and it's a context of will to keep them under control. Even Shinji, with all that he's the one with the most strongly disciplined soul, has the weakest hollow of the lot, and can count on the help of a fully realized Zanpakuto that achieved Bankai, is only able to keep his mask up for 10 minutes or so. It's annoying is what it is, but the only way they're practical to use in combat, at least where I'm concerned, is as a brief temporary power-up. I understand. It must not be easy for a warrior like you, to be given such a weapon and have so little ability to use it. She brightened at that, as if pleased at the comment. Yeah. You really are observant. It's nice to talk with somebody who understands my point of view. The others always bemoan the fact we were infected with this thing, but I say, why cry over spilt milk? A true warrior grows stronger from surviving adversities, and this is about as literal a way to do that as you can get. Enough for you to want to work for the one who did it to you. Hiyori answered Chad's leading question. He really wanted to understand what was going on with these Visored, because Hiyori in no way could be squared with what he'd been said to expect of them, by laughing uproariously. Oh man, no way. That bastard is going down as soon as I can get my hands around his neck. I've called dibs from everyone and I'm not going to let Shinji's moralizing get in the way. And to do that, I'll need to take you down first, which, let me say it, I'm really glad I got the chance to. You've been a worthy opponent so far. But we're done now, I'm winning this right now. Chad didn't let her take action after saying that, instead firing two of his beams. Hiyori smashed the first with her sword again, then placed her hand over her face as she summoned the mask again and roared. Now, watch this. And as she did, 3 beams of red energy erupted from her, 2 from her hands and the third from her horn. Chad saw them hitting his own beam and burning through it like it wasn't even there, and only managed to avoid being disintegrated by them by reflexively using his power to send himself to the ground. He turned to where Hiyori was to her knees, recovering, and couldn't help himself to ask. What was that? That's Zero, the ultimate hollow attacks. You know how hollow feed themselves by eating other souls, because their Ryotsu naturally breaks the normal bounds of Reishi to absorb it and then have the Ryotsu resulting from that destruction added to their bodies, which fuel their regeneration. Zero is that, weaponized. Instead of using the normal hollow Ryotsu, which is imprinted with their emotions and thus has the weirdest of powers, Zero is the Ryotsu purified of all emotions and unleashed as far and as quick as it can go. It takes centuries for an hollow to be able to purify their own Ryotsu like that. Only the oldest can fire it, and even then, firing too many of them at once can consume all of the hollow's Ryotsu and kill them from overexertion, so it's a rare move. But since it eats the Reishi and Ryotsu it touches and absorbs it, it's pretty much unstoppable. Chad blinked at the explanation, but he quickly grasped why she'd explained it so much. You used 3 of them at once, because when the hollow is sealed inside of you, it doesn't matter if you overextend, the hollow will not consume itself using it, Or if it did, you would still be happy at the result anyway. Yes. You really get me. Once I realized my hollow was capable of using it, I've been trying for a long time to have it unleash all of its power at once to see if it'd purge it out of me, but I haven't been able to this far. That's why I started experimenting with firing multiples, and I think I'm the first one ever to be able to fire 3-0 at once. Just as she finished saying that, Hiyori suddenly threw her sword at him. With no wind-up or warning, he realized the mask had appeared on her face for a split second as she did, giving her the strength necessary to pull it off, and then he had to dive to the side to avoid the weapon that would kill him if he touched it. That resulted in finding himself facing Hiyori as the girl went hand to hand with him, attacking him with a clearly well-practiced sequence of punches and kicks. He had to ignore his usual instinct of stopping the attacks and instead focusing on dodging, and he knew it was a good move because occasionally, in combination with one of her attacks, the mask would suddenly appear on the girl's face, and the sheer increase in strength of those particular attacks was made clear by the amount of air displaced by them being 10 times more than from any of the others. He still tried to make her attacks bounce back by making the air offer more resistance to them, but it was clear that Hiyori had no longer any difficulty in overcoming that particular trick. Chad needed something new, and fast, because once again, the girl was forcing him backwards, using the occasional jet of fire to keep him grounded, but this time, she was clearly aiming to eventually put him with his back against her sword, and kill him that way. In truth, he had a few tricks left that he thought might help him get in the powerful hit he needed to win this, especially now that she didn't have the sword to stop them anymore, but that'd only work if Chad could figure a way around the mask, which Hiyori was now using with regularity. In fact, Chad realized, too much regularity, and he realized that this was the reason she'd not been using it this far. To keep the mask weakness hidden, she'd said she could only keep it on for a short time, but the way she was using it now, he got the sense that what that actually meant was that the ability has some form of cooldown. After using it, she had to wait for a brief interval before pulling it out again. But before he put his plan into action, he had to be sure. So, immediately after dodging a hit where the mask appeared on Hiyori's face, he left himself open to the follow-up, focusing all of his Ryutsu into not just his skin, but also his muscles, and his bones underneath, making himself as hard as he could be, and the hit that slammed into him them, as powerful as it was, and he felt blood come from the hit, as if she'd stabbed him with something sharp rather than a fist, did not break through nor send him flying, the way a masked hit would have. Hiyori looked surprised herself, although he wasn't sure if at managing a successful hit or at him withstanding it. Regardless, he had only 3 seconds to win before her mask was back on, so he slammed his fist into the ground, forcing the blades of grass to harden as if they were made of iron, then shoulder-checking Hiyori so she fell into it, taking another 3 hits from her in the process, and as she was surprised and partially paralyzed by being pierced all over, he charged his gauntlet and fired 3 beams straight into her. As he looked down, the girl was covered in a good deal of burns, battered and covered in blood. She wore her mask once more, and just as she did, he fired again. He did it 3 more times, firing whenever she put the mask on, both making it impossible for her to get up and keeping her from recovering to any big extent, until finally she stopped trying, spreading her arms wide as she said, sounding, of all things, quite amused. "All right, you won, that was well fought. Now come on, kill me, you earned it." Chad shook his head, and answered, "I never had any intention of killing you." She frowned at that, clearly unhappy at the thought. "What, do you think I'm not worth killing? I'll warn you, if you don't do it, I'll come after you when I recover, and I'll be stronger then. You shouldn't underestimate me." "I'm not, I just want to understand what's going on here." She huffed, but nodded. "Ask away then, not like I've got anything else to do anyway." Chapter 20, Resourcefulness. The moment their surrounding changed around them, Ishida Uriah focused on his spiritual perception. He didn't even have to turn around to know that about half the people that had been in the park before had suddenly disappeared, while he was transported to a different copy of the location with only 4 other people, 3 of which were enemies. But even if he'd had only a few moments to examine everybody's signatures, he was fairly certain he'd been confined with the 3 weakest among their opponents. He'd won against superior numbers before, he just needed to maintain focus and play his cards straight. The greatest danger in a situation like this was underestimating your opponents. And he even had support this time. "Where are we?" Why did the park changed so much? Which he probably should try to reassure, some would. It's a pocket dimension, created to trap us so we cannot escape and they can fight us using all of their abilities. It is a spiritual battlefield, a copy of reality that reflects the world, but is not like it. But we didn't go through any mirror or wardrobe. No, but one of them used Keto, and I believe that our opponent here might have helped. Uriah pointed to Yukio Voreben, the blonde teenager on the ground, fiddling with his console down on the ground. When he noticed Ishida and Orium focusing on him, he looked up with a smirk as he said, "Impressive, isn't it? My power was already pretty good, but mixing it with Shinigami magic made it that much more effective. Do you want to surrender? You treated me fair enough when I was your prisoner, I can promise you the same." Uriah had to raise an eyebrow at that. "They put you in charge." "Not really, but since you'd need to be housed in my pocket dimension, I'm the only one who can decide how you will be held. This is my domain, after all." "Oh. This is another video game world, like the one I was trapped into the other time. That's what you do, right? Make fake worlds to trap people into." The blonde boy seemed annoyed by Orium's comment, as he turned to glare at her and commented, "I can do much more than that, actually. Why don't I show you?" Before he could do anything, however, one of the two people with him, the big black man with cornrows that Uriah identified as Jerome Guid Bat, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, stopping him as he said, gaze focused on Uriah even as he addressed Voreben. "Because if they surrender, there will be no need for that. Remember, the captain wants to speak with them, to learn what Aizen plan really is. If they accept to be taken captive and answer some questions, there would be no need to fight." Of course, Uriah had no intention to surrender, but he wanted to see if he couldn't learn something about what was going on here, so he asked, lacing his voice with curiosity while making sure his actual emotions were shielded from outside perception. "And what if we were unwilling to answer your questions after we had surrendered? How would your leader go about getting the answers he wants?" The big man frowned, clearly annoyed by the question. Uriah wasn't sure if because the man didn't want to answer, or just was surprised that Uriah was even entertaining the possibility. He could probably get something out of him, but not easily. He'd have to tailor his needling carefully if he wanted to learn whatever it was that the Shinigami were hiding from him. But before he could think of a good follow-up, the third of their opponent, Gabrielle Burness, the lanky woman with hair in two different colors, interrupted their conversation with an almost whiny tone. "Come on, they aren't really going to surrender, everybody knows that. We should have just followed my plan, singling out one of their group to launch an all-out attack on, and unleashed the hollows we have under control on them as well for good measure. Then we'd have the prisoner we need and all the time in the world to make them talk." The other Shinigami frowned at that, while the young Fullbringer looked annoyed, but it was Orium who spoke next, and she sounded outraged. "No, you shouldn't have done that at all. That could have hurt a lot of people. It would be wrong." Burness looked up at Orium as if seeing her for the first time, eyes wide with surprise. "Are you for real, girl?" "Of course I am. And we're not going to surrender, because you'll hurt people if we do. You surrender, and then nobody will get hurt at all." Uriah grimaced. He didn't disagree with Orium's position, but he had hoped to be able to drag their enemies into a prolonged conversation and get some serious information out of them, under the pretense that he just might surrender after all. But to do it now would be impossible. He would just need to get his answer by needling them in battle, probably focusing on Voreben and Burness rather than Guid Bat, since the first two seemed to be more easily goaded than the latter. Meanwhile, their other opponents' expressions hardened at Orium's declaration, the male visored letting go of the young boy even as he nodded to the woman. In a moment, the two charged upwards, running on air and heading straight for them. Uriah found himself impressed by how quickly they'd switched to the offensive. That was some quick thinking. Still, they were no match for the speed of his Hyrankyaku, so he slid next to Orium to ask, in a serious tone. "Your healing ability can make them recover from anything short of death, right?" When the girl nodded, he returned the gesture, then went on. "Then I want you to use your barriers to keep the big guy busy and separate him from the others. I'll try to nail them down so they're immobilized, and you can heal them afterwards." He didn't wait for an answer. The enemy was almost upon them, instead grabbing his Quincy cross and materializing his bow. In truth, he could create the weapon without it. It was one of the first thing any Quincy learned how to do, but the whole point of the pendant was that, once a Reishi construct was formed, it could be anchored to it, so it'd maintain itself rather than needing the user's constant focus. And in a battle like this, he was going to concentrate on much more important things than keeping his bow going. Uriah let out a few repeated shots, low in powers but capable of being fired faster, in a vertical pattern that forced the two incoming visored to dodge in different directions. As soon as they were far enough away from one another, he slid backwards, nodding to himself as he saw that Orium had blocked the man as he'd asked, and thus he had only the woman to deal with right now. Just what he'd hoped for. As the enemy charged and he continued to retreat, Uriah remarked, keeping his tone light. "So, you said you wanted to unleash hollows on us, yet you're attacking on your own. What changed your mind?" "It's not my decision to make, the captain said so. We're still members of the 3rd Division, we follow the orders we are given. That's our duty. I was under the impression Soul Society considers you all to be criminals. I doubt they'd agree with what you just said." "That's only because we were framed. We weren't able to control our inner hollows back then, so we went on a rampage after we were infected, but it wasn't of our own free will. We still consider ourselves members of the Godi 13, and once we prove our innocence, we'll all be reintegrated." "And you will achieve that by helping the man who infected you? How does that work?" "The captain didn't infect us, he never would have. The revenge he wants is the same we want. We all were framed by Aizen, he's the one that infected us." Uriah had to admit, that sounded like a very interesting tale. While they'd known from the Foolbringer's confession that Hirako Shinji had claimed that he'd been framed by Aizen and this was the reason for his actions, both Urahara and Shihoin had confirmed that Aizen had done no such thing, and they themselves had both seen proof of Hirako's treason and the man himself committing these acts he was accused of, as well as both having fought him personally. It was of course fully possible that the three were just conspiring together. Uriah had not enough information to tell, but of course, it would be silly to simply believe something an enemy had said in battle, especially if said thing was both to the enemy's advantage and the kind of thing that might make somebody turn on their allies. Still, he found the new information interesting enough to keep retreating at just enough speed that his opponent couldn't close to melee range, the woman seemingly failing to realize that Uriah was only letting her tire herself, and he continued the conversation while letting curiosity into his voice. "Is that so? You saw it happen. What does that matter? I know it was him. Do you now? If you didn't see it happen, you could be making an honest mistake. Maybe if you surrender you could talk it out and find that things didn't go the way you think they did." "As if. The captain told us that he knew Aizen was guilty, and he would never lie to us." Uriah shook his head. That was a really silly amount of trust to put into anybody, but he supposed that for a group structured as strictly as Shinigami were, it was to be expected. It also meant that he wasn't really going to get much else out of this conversation. However, whether Hirako had tricked his subordinates or Aizen had framed them, or the truth was something else entirely, he was not going to learn it here, and in any case, the woman specifically referenced using hollows as weapons, and that was not something he would let stand. Exterminating hollows was a Quincy's duty, and forgiving anybody who worked with them was not something Uriah could ever do. Speaking of which, it would probably be better to bait out those hollows now. The last thing it wanted was his opponents pulling them out as a surprise later in the battle. "Is that why you are not sending your hollows against me, saving them for Aizen? You really could use them." "I don't have them with me, the captain is the one who has them. And besides, I'd need no help if you weren't a coward and just stopped to fight, instead of running away like you are. I can help with that." Uriah looked down at Voreben, who for some reason hadn't taken to the air but had instead been following after them by running on the ground. He pressed a couple of buttons on the video game controller in his hand, and suddenly, a massive brick wall appeared from nowhere just behind Uriah, completely blocking his path of retreat. He managed to stop just in time to avoid slamming into it, his control of Hiran Kyoka once again proving up to the task, but then Burnus finally closed the distance with a shout of "Got you," and all he could do was drain as much Reishi from the air straight into his blood as he could. Even as his veins glowed blue under his skin, he knew that the slightly different setup of this pocket dimension was slowing the absorption, and thus he still had his wind knocked out of him and could feel bruises forming when the Vizard's knee slammed into his abdomen and sent him crashing into the wall behind them. The woman stabbed her Zanpakuto into the wall to keep herself anchored while keeping him pinned with the knee, her other hand striking to grab his wrist that was holding the bow and pinning it to the wall as well, after which she showed off a victorious grin. "Now let's see whether your body's endurance can match a soul's pure determination, Quincy." She pulled her head back, clearly aiming to headbutt him, and he would bet she planned to keep doing it until he was battered into submission. He knew only a little about the Shinigami arts, but among the things he knew was that they could keep their defenses up for long periods of time, whereas keeping blood up for too long, especially for him that wasn't very good at it, was akin to self-poisoning yourself to death. He wouldn't win this contest of endurance. Luckily, he didn't have to. Even as his right hand was pinned to the wall and he didn't have his bow, his left was still free, so he twirled his wrist, letting one of the many small silver capsules he'd sewn in the inside of his sleeves fall into his hand. It was a thin but long one, not dissimilar from a pencil in size, and the moment he willed it, it suddenly released a long reishi blade from its tip that cut straight and deeply into his enemy's side, causing her to dart backwards in fear as she held her bleeding waist in disbelief. "What is that?" Uriah twirled the item into his hand, so that he was now holding it properly with the blade upwards just like a sword, and explained. "This is a type of Jinto, a capsule that has been filled with reishi collected with a Quincy's power, which is then released in a specific pattern to achieve a certain effects. You can think of them as a Quincy's equivalent of Shinigami's Kido. As long as care is taken with the release pattern, they can achieve quite a lot of different results. This specific one is sending the reishi collected within up and dragging it back, like a circuit, keeping it fixed in place. We call it a Seelschneider." Burnus seemed speechless, which left Uriah somewhat annoyed. Clearly he wasn't going to be able to get anything else out of the woman, so he should perhaps drop the theatrics altogether and focus on simply taking her down. He was about to do just that, when a handcuff suddenly appeared around his right hand, pinning it to the wall behind him. He moved his left away just in time to stop it from being snared as well, although that resulted into his ankles being ensnared instead. "Ah. I'd told you that my powers are much greater now than they ever were before. I used to need to program every world I created in advance, but now I can modify things on the fly. I'm invincible now." Uriah raised an eyebrow at Voreben's proclamation, then turned to watch Burnus, and was surprised to see that the woman had recovered almost entirely from her wound. His eyes narrowed at that. Shinigami weren't supposed to heal that fast normally, so he would guess that she had some sort of healing trick. He'd need to be on the lookout for that. The Vizard herself, meanwhile, was looking down at the blonde boy in incredulity. "Why did you said that? Did nobody ever teach you not to tempt fate?" The boy shrugged. "Yeah, whatever, this isn't even the strong one, it's the girl who beat me last time. Just knock him out, he's trapped there." Uriah shook his head at the duo's antics, then said, trying to inject his voice with as much contempt as he could manage. "Am I now?" Both turned to watch him at that, and with 3 slashes of his weapon, he cut apart all of the binding holding him in place, before using a quick dash forward with Hirin Kyaku to avoid being ensnared again. Voreben looked shocked at that, and shouted. "Those were supposed to be harder than steel. No blade should be able to cut that." "Whatever, just try to keep ensnaring him while I attack, he can't both cut himself free and fight me at once." Uriah raised an eyebrow at that. "I can't." Burnus charged at him rather than answer. He could have dodged or evaded, but not without losing sight of Voreben, so instead he countercharged, his blade of energy smashing into the woman's sword, pushing her backward. She glanced at the blade with a frown, looking at the place where the weapons had met, and where her blade had been chipped, before returning an accusatory glare at him. "That's no ordinary blade. Normal reishi can't arm a Zanpakuto." Just as Uriah was about to answer, the boy underneath pressed a couple buttons on his device again, and rotating steel platforms appeared around him, with chains springing from one to the other to trap him in. He slashed all around himself, severing the chains as they appeared, as he spoke back, keeping the Vizard in sight. The Seelschneider creates a flow of reishi constantly vibrating as it moves back and forth. If one were to consider how it actually works, a chainsaw would be the best comparison. Even at the lower frequencies, a single second of contact is the equivalent of 1,000 strikes. The best examples can reach up to a few millions. Zanpakuto might well be the sturdiest construct of Reishi ever devised, but they're not indestructible, not even in the hands of a master. And you, Burnus, haven't even unlocked your Shikai yet. The data we were given on your group was clear about that. He raised the weapon in front of himself as the chains finally stopped spawning, Yukio apparently flummoxed at the ease he was being countered with, and Uriah concluded, pointing the seal Schneider at the Vizard. We Quincy created these weapons specifically to counter your kind. Give up, you can't beat me. The woman answered with a roar and charged forward. He parried the first attack, leaving another nick in the sword, then started to use Hirin Kyaku to slide around her, parrying when she managed to slash at him in time, thrusting and leaving small wounds on her when she didn't. Her Zanpakuto didn't break as he'd hoped. It seemed that, even if she wasn't a master, she knew how to make the blade self-repair, if only slowly so, and her swordsmanship form wasn't bad, although Uriah thought it worse than his own, and he was no master swordsman. But even with that, it was clear she was not used to dueling with somebody who outclassed her in speed as much as he did. He was running rings around her, while actually tiring himself next to nothing, since the benefit of Hirin Kyaku was that he could slide at incredible speeds without needing to move a single muscle, and she was clearly having trouble keeping up. Whatever she'd used to patch herself up had clearly not been enough, as the wound at her waist was still bleeding, if only a small bit and only occasionally, and that was without counting the number of wounds he'd inflicted on her since. He would win this on endurance alone, that much was clear. The Vizard was not an opponent on his same level. Burnus seemed to realize it as well, as she stopped trying to hit him and stood still in midair. Uriah did the same, moving to a relaxed guard position as he said, no emotion in his voice. You can surrender at any time, you can see you're outmatched, there's no need to go any further. She chuckled, and it was a dark sound, yet Uriah narrowed his eyes and refocused his attention, for he was certain that her attitude was not that of one ready to give up, rather quite the opposite. I suppose it was foolish to think we could take down a strike team Aizen put together specifically to take down us all without going all out. I hate that I have to resort to this, but you'll regret it more, mark my words. I only hope you don't die because of it. Then, suddenly, the reading of her soul changed, her form enveloped in a whirlpool of furious riot so that appeared so suddenly it could be compared to an explosion in the power and speed it manifested itself at. A mask of white bone formed over her face, diamond-shaped and with no visible eye sockets or mouth, only a cross-shaped hole in its middle. Yet Uriah could sense that the mask was only the most visible of changes. Attached to the mask, if practically invisible, was a paper-thin force field that covered Burnus' entire body. One might have called it skin-tight, but Uriah realized it was more than that. It was fused to her skin, much like the mask itself was to her skull. But that was only the external change. What mattered most was the power. It was almost as if her soul was now producing twice the amount of Ryotsu all of a sudden, perhaps even a bit more than that, and given that the density of a soul was what determined its physical abilities, he was willing to bet this meant his enemy just gained a considerable increase in power, in addition to the simple fact that, since Shinigami used Ryotsu to fuel their many different abilities, she likely was going to be able to become much more effective on that front as well. And indeed, a heartbeat later, Burnus dashed forward, sword held in both hands, and when Uriah went for a parry, the hit was so strong he was forced into a block instead, and would probably have been pushed out of his Hirin Kyaku platform if his control of it hadn't been good enough to make it slide it backwards as he himself did. The one satisfaction he got from it was that, when his opponent pulled her sword back, there was a much larger, more visible nick where the blades had smacked into each other. She might be physically stronger than him now, but her weapon hadn't gotten any better than before. Or so he thought, at least, until he felt a huge amount of Ryotsu erupting from the mask and rushing along the skin-tight force field she had on, and whenever the energy reached one of her wounds, it filled them, causing them to heal in a sudden burst of regeneration, while the portion of it that reached her hands filled the sword and repaired it to perfect condition instantly. And suddenly what was going on became very clear to him. You're using the hollow trapped inside of you as an energy source, stealing their Ryotsu and power for yourself. Is this what being a Vizard means? She chuckled, and her answer was delivered in a gravelly voice that was threatening without needing to try. Not just that. I can access the Hollow's abilities as well, by changing my Ryuryoku to let it match what it has. And I can also use the Ryotsu itself in new ways, since my body is different now. Like this. Uriah had a split second to feel the buildup of Ryotsu in Burnus' legs, before he felt a sudden rip open in her skin-tight force field, the Ryotsu exploding out of it in a burst that pushed her forward at a speed unlike any she'd used before. In fact, Uriah realized as he tried to dodge out of it, a speed greater than his own. Unable to avoid the attack, he barely managed to call on his blood ability fast enough to keep the sheer impact from being fatal, but it was still powerful enough to smack into him, sending him smashing into the ground. He got up quickly enough, and reformed his Hirin Kyaku slid, then frowned as he noticed that Burnus was closing on him at a much slower speed, using her normal Shinigami airwalk rather than the ability she'd used before. Going on a hunch, he flipped the Seal Schneider around so he had his top two fingers free, then created a bow and sent a quick hail of low-powered arrows at her. She was troubled in avoiding them all, in fact a couple even hit her, although she immediately answered by triggering her regeneration to negate the damage. But when he focused, taking the time to charge up an actually powerful arrow and let that one fly, Burnus used that ability once more. He could tell from the sudden buildup and release of Ryotsu, which pushed her out of the way of the attack easily, but then had her stop a brief distance away, and even with the mask hiding her features, she clearly looked winded by the effort. Uriah smirked at the sight. "Well, that's interesting. It seems like your little trick only works in small bursts, isn't it? I don't think that's gonna be enough to defeat me, now that I know its weakness." And, while he didn't reveal it, he was sure it was more than that. He would bet that not only was the ability only good for short bursts of acceleration, but it also lacked any ability to change direction mid-push. Overall, it was a powerful ability, but far less reliable than the Shinigami's equivalent, and certainly no match for Hirin Kyaku, especially if he were willing to shoulder the cost required to use it at full power, instead of how he'd been thus far keeping to what he could do indefinitely. He was considering if his enemy's new power was worth taking that kind of risk, when she spoke, clearly annoyed that he'd figured out her ability so quickly. "Well, if that's so easy for you to deal with, then maybe it's time I show you this Hollow's unique power. Let's see if you can keep up with that as well." Then, before Uriah knew what was happening, a deafening sound filled the air, a screech of terrifying intensity and pitch that almost had him retching. As it was, he fell to his knees over his Reishi platform, and almost instinctively had it lead him away at top speed. A moment later, the field in the point he'd been standing at exploded as a sonic blast slammed into it, leaving a crater behind. Uriah got shakily to his feet, looking upward at the sky where Burnus had removed her mask. Clearly the exertion had left her in need of recuperating, but with his head still ringing and his sense of balance not yet recovered, the young Quincy had no way of taking advantage of the opening that offered. He needed a way to counter her sonic attack if he was to win, but before he could figure that out, Orium's voice suddenly cut through his thoughts. "Uriah, they've trapped me. Help." Uriah turned to where Orium was standing with her feet tied to the ground by heavy iron shackles. She was using one of her shields to push back the repeated attacks of Guid Bat, who was now also wearing a mask of white bone, this one completely flat and with 6 slit holes, 3 for side, as well as several bands of bones wrapped around the man's head. He was pushing back Orium's shield with each of his brutally powerful punches, and while she kept forcing the shield forward, it was clear he was slowly gaining ground, whereas Orium could not retreat. Which was, of course, the fault of Voreben. Uriah chastised himself for having lost sight of the small Fullbringer while he faced the hollowified Burnus. The boy was being attacked by Orium's other 3 fairies, but he was pressing buttons on his toy as fast as he could, creating traps and walls, cages and obstacles, keeping them at bay while also stopping them from going to free Orium. Uriah mustered his focus, glancing at where Burnus was clearly recovered and closing in, likely preparing to reactivate her hollow mask when she was close enough to make it count. The mask had almost made the woman his equal. He was confident he could figure her out, but if the other one was similarly powerful, and with Voreben's support, he worried of their possibilities. Still, freeing Orium came first, and then he could go all out. Without wasting any more time, he charged for the girl, even as he called out to her. "Orium, keep your attacks up on the blonde boy, don't give him time to use his power if you can." She nodded, and Uriah saw with his peripheral vision that the 3 fairies' attacks intensified. They didn't really manage to do much to overcome Voreben's constant creation of new obstacles, but did keep him focused on themselves, which was all he needed. Just as he was about to reach Orium, he turned on himself, even as the sled continued to carry him toward his friend on its own, and he let out a Region-Licht at minimum power. The arrow fragmented into barely 100, and all low-powered ones, but the attack was still enough to force Bernice, who had activated her mask and just about ready to use her burst ability to smash into his back, to stop and use it to dodge instead, giving Ishida just enough time to cut Orium's shackles with the Seal Schneider and drag her along his sled with him, before he had the platform raise upward in an almost vertical ascent, allowing them to raise above Orium's shield so he could fire down at Guid Bat, forcing him to retreat so that his friend could recall the shield to them. Uriah looked at where Orium was recovering her breath, but also smiling in gratitude, and he focused his eyes back on Bernice as he asked, "Does your opponent has any special power that you saw? I think he creates small earthquakes with his punches?" It felt like his attacks were hitting the whole shield at once instead of just one point, that's why it was so easy for him to push it back. Uriah nodded, a close combat power was something he could handle. Alright then, the woman behind his can use sound blasts and ultrasounds, try to stop those with your shield, I'll take down the other guy. No, you won't. Uriah turned in the direction of Voreben, who had suddenly appeared next to them. He struck with the blade in his hands immediately, and instead of leaving a wound, the figure shattered in a number of glowing shards of light, even as another one appeared and shouted, "Let's see how well you can hold up against something unstoppable." And then, above them, a meteorite formed, suddenly falling out of the sky. Uriah's eyes widened at that, and as he fired an arrow at it, it smashed into the giant rock while barely causing any damage. He frowned, which caused Voreben to smile in triumph as he said, "Ah, you see? Here, I am completely invincible." "That's not it, I'm just annoyed with myself that I only brought a single Seal Schneider. What do you think your little sword can do against something like that?" Ishida didn't pay the boy much attention. The fact he'd have to sacrifice what was the best option for close combat he had in his arsenals at the moment wasn't pleasant, but he couldn't see another option here. He would really need to focus for this one, but before he did, he felt the need to correct Voreben's misconception, much as he tried not to do it when in combat. In this case there was no harm in it, and precision was a virtue after all, something to strive for. "This isn't a sword. Don't you know? The weapons of Quincy are bow and arrows." Then he placed the blade across his bow, focusing as much as he could. Heilig Feel was the one of the 6 Quincy arts in which he was by far less skilled. He was nowhere near being able to replicate the Seal Schneider on his own in a non-Jinto form, much less combine it with another. Even doing it like this was to the limit of what he'd ever tried, but he had no alternative. Bernice clearly had no intention of letting him do so, as he felt the buildup of her sonic blast, but he trusted Orium to catch it with her shield, and let out his arrow, whispering Region-Licht just as he initiated the chain reaction at its full power. This time, the arrow didn't stop at a mere 100, multiplying into several thousands as the Reishi split and split and split again, yet with every arrow retaining both the power and, most importantly, the constantly Reishi cycling effect of the Seal Schneider. When the attack reached the meteorite, the number of arrows was enough to cover a whole quarter of its surface, but, most importantly, they went through the huge rock with ease, the sawing movement increasing the penetration power of the attack, cutting every part of it into ever smaller pieces, robbing them of their momentum so that many fell to the ground well before they could reach them, while the rest smashed into each other, sending themselves off course reciprocally. Everybody else stared at the results of the attacks with wide eyes and slaw-jacked expressions, as the remains of the meteor fell around them while leaving Uriah and Orium completely untouched. Uriah himself stood still and straight-backed, projecting the image of absolute confidence, while hiding how tired he was feeling because, if he didn't, he'd be on his knees and trembling in exhaustion. That was the largest charge reaction he'd ever initiated for a Region-Licht before, and the strain he'd put on his body to manipulate so much Reishi at once, even if only for the brief second of initiation, would normally be enough for him to consider a few hours of bed rest, yet they had more work to do, so he'd need to push himself. He was nearing his limit already after such a feat, but it was clear that to win this, he'd need to go past it. That was so cool. Uriah, you're awesome. No. No, that should have been impossible. How did you stop it? You weren't supposed to be able to stop it. You little madman, what do you mean he shouldn't have stopped it? That could have killed us all. Bernice seemed ready to tear into the Fullbringer some more, while for his own the kid seemed ready to argue back, but the third of their opponent, who was no longer wearing his hollow mask right now, interrupted them before they could go any further. That's enough. Gab, we can't wear kid gloves anymore. Let's go all out. Ugh, I hate doing that. We've no alternative. If he used an attack like that against us in sealed form, we'd be done for. Burnus nodded, and then both of them wore their masks, except this time, Uriah felt as all of their riot so suddenly transformed, much more quickly and completely than it had before, and their bodies both transformed, with Guid Bat turning into a metal creature, all slick lines and square corners, with bolts popping out of the places where joints should have been. Yet, for all that it looked made of metal, the color was the same bone white as its slit mask, like some sort of twisted combination of hollow and robot. Burnus, meanwhile, had her body replaced with a black skeleton, with fur clinging to the bones without any flesh in between, except that where arms would have been where large, leathery wings instead. They charged, with Guid Bat punching the ground to cause an earthquake that cut open wide chasms and raised spires of stones from the ground, which he then proceeded to punch in their direction with power comparable to cannonballs, while Burnus above unleashed a continuous, uninterrupted, and much more powerful screech than before, making Orium collapse on his moving platform with a cry of pain. Uriah himself only managed to avoid the same fate by having used blood on just his ears, reducing the sound to bearable levels, although it was only a temporary measure. Still, he placed a hand on Orium, which to an external observer would look like he was reassuring her, but in truth was to keep himself standing straight, which she obviously realized, if the suddenly scared look she shot him was anything to go by. Still, he kept her from asking question by offering one of his own, using a tone that made him sound in absolute control. Your other fairies, are they still attacking the Fullbringer? Yes, why? They never took their eyes away from him, did they? I don't think so, no. Uriah, what you're planning? Too long to explain, just call two of them back, but make sure the third remains next to him and keeps an eye on him the whole time, but without attacking anymore. I need him to think they are all gone. Orium clearly didn't understood, but she nodded, closing her eyes as she focused. Meanwhile, Uriah turned to the enemies closing in, even as he dropped all of the Jinto he had prepared into his hands. He would need them all, because with how tired he was and how much focus what he was going to do next would need, using his bow wouldn't be an option he could afford. First thing first, he threw one upward, just along Burnus' path, triggering it to activate just in front of her. The sudden release of light and sound that resulted from that would have been confusing enough on its own, but more than that, the Jinto released also a burst of chaotic riot so that would confuse the spiritual perception of most creatures, and especially hollows. With one opponent distracted and Orium's shield protecting them from the attacks coming from below, he used his full focus to use Hiran Kyaku to the fullest, creating multiple paths, ones that intersected each other, huge curves, sudden drops, multiple sleds affixed to each one, areas of the paths that could be moved at will, and more structure that would look like a labyrinth to any who studied it, although these paths he made so thin that they would be practically invisible if one wasn't looking for them. He had to keep the whole map of the place in mind, for forgetting even a piece would see that piece disappear from the actual construction. The trick to Hiran Kyaku was that it manipulated the Reishi already present in the surroundings reflexively, rather than actively like Heiligfeel would. Instead of conscious control, it operated on reaction times and predetermined responses to events. And for a true master like Uriah knew he was, it was possible to create multiple interconnected reactions that worked autonomously, so long as concentration was maintained and focus wasn't lost. Uriah felt Orium's fairies arriving to their location, and before they even spoke, he used Riso Tenge to create a single Reishi string, tying one end to his wrist while giving the other end to one of them as he said, tone direct and preventing any interruption. Hold this string and go back to where your friend stayed behind, then wait there. He let the fairy go, then knelt next to Orium, whispering to her. Dismiss your shield, keep your fairies close, and hold on to me, no matter what, never let go. And then, they were off, as the sled they were on accelerated to the maximum velocity it could reach. Burnus had recovered and was flying after them now, and Guidbat's projectiles were no longer being intercepted, but at the speed they were going now, it didn't matter anymore. They left the flying Vizard behind, even her sudden burst of acceleration barely letting her regain a bit of ground before they left her behind once more, and then they reached the first intersection of paths, where Uriah's sled slid straight under a different one that immediately started to move in the opposite direction, with Uriah grabbing Orium and making the smallest of hops so that they landed on the newly moving one while the old one continued in the other direction. To an unaware observer, it seemed as if they'd just taken a sudden 90-degree turn, not only without slowing down, but actually accelerating even further. And that was but the beginning, as Uriah's labyrinth of slides soon had him letting his two opponents fully confused on which direction they should go, while he moved at a speed they would have trouble following with their eyes. And while their ranged attacks had now no change of ever hitting, and their ability to close in melee was denied by the sled's constant movement, Uriah himself was prepared for it. Whenever their path would lead them close enough to one of the two visored to make it feasible, he would drop a Jinto right next to them. Some simply erupted in devastating explosions of Reishi, others released hails of spikes, one caused a palisade to grow for the flying one to slam into, another released a sudden wind push that sent the other to the ground, and overall the effect was that they were being harassed, wounded, and left disoriented without pause as the offensive went on. Of course, Uriah knew that he had a pretty small amount of Jinto to use. He really hadn't had the time to prepare many, and then he'd had to split them among the group, but that didn't really matter. This whole thing only served the one goal he had, to leave the visored unable to pursue as he reached Voreben. The boy saw him coming, and just as Uriah had expected, he created a multitude of copies of himself, but Uriah ignored them all, even closing his eyes to avoid being distracted, focusing only on the string at his wrist that led him to where the boy was. When he realized he couldn't fool him, Voreben desperately created a dome around himself, but Uriah simply reached out, his hand disintegrating over half of the dome as he touched it, leaving Voreben struck with surprise just long enough for that same hand to close around his neck. The boy's eyes were wide as he looked at Uriah like one would a demon. How? How did you? Do you not know that the power of Quincy is to manipulate Reishi? This dimension you're so proud of, that you trapped us into, it is all made of it. And thus, everything in it, I can do with as I will. That was, of course, a vast exaggeration. The fifth of the Quincy arts, Kirchenlied, was focused on using the ability of gathering Reishi to create stable constructs of the material. After all souls, and everything in the afterlife, was made of Reishi stacked together, the pieces connected in much the same way atoms would be. Which meant, of course, that assembling anything out of it, much less a specific item or something else equally detailed and complex, was about as difficult as building a house by hand, possible, but hugely time-consuming and requiring extensive knowledge of what you were trying to build. At its most basic, the ability of Quincy to create weapons out of Reishi was really just another expression of Kirchenlied, just simplified by the use of a focus item to anchor the construct to. Which meant that Uriah's ability to influence anything was really quite limited, especially since he was only middling at using the skill and needed to be touching what he was building to make it work. But breaking apart something like a dome of earth, which really only required moving some of the earth to the sides and letting it slide down. That much he knew he could do, and seeing the way Voreben kept creating simple structures made of simple materials, he'd been willing to bet that, when panicked, he'd have defended himself with something he could break through. And now it worked, which meant he just needed to complete the last step of the plan. You're just faster at it, but that's the only advantage you have, and this close, it won't matter. Now, create a canal from the lake to our position, and a pillar right where I tell you, and maybe I won't turn your little dreamland into a nightmare. Where to? There. He threw one of his last 3 remaining Jinto, and one of only 2 that'd actually be useful here, and the boy did as he'd told. Just as Uriah had planned, the pillar rose to stop Berna's new attempt to dive at him now that he was finally standing still, forcing her to move upwards. And that was when he activated his device, 7 pillars of vibrating Reishi sprouting from it to surround the woman before uniting together around her to form a cage. Then, he turned, and just as the charging Guid bat stepped into the water, he threw the other Jinto at him, triggering it the moment it smacked into his chest and releasing a surge of electricity that, thanks to the water underneath his target, saw its power amplified by many times, causing the visored to collapse into the water. As a smoking mess. Jerome. Uriah looked at where Bernice had retreated her wing from the bar of her cage, and while she started at the cut on it, he explained for her benefit. The bars of that cage are made following the same principles as the Seal Schneider. You can't get through them without being sliced to pieces. Just sit tight, your friend isn't dead, and anything else he has, we can cure him from. The Vizard nodded, and her hollow form slowly receded, along with the mask, leaving her back to her human form. In the stream, Guidbat was doing the same, although that was likely an involuntary reaction, since he was unconscious. Uriu took the controller from Voraben's hands, handing it over to Orium as he said, "Please don't give this back to him, I'll take it back in a minute, I just need to rest a bit first." That said, he laid down to the ground, breathing deeply, yet he couldn't help but be satisfied with himself at the victory, no matter how tired achieving it had left him. Much as he wanted to, Ichigo had no choice but to continue retreating in front of Hiriko's implacable advance. The man wasn't even hurrying himself, merely keeping pace with Ichigo's speed easily since his own was far greater, and merely ensuring Ichigo couldn't mount any serious counter-attack simply by the sheer threat coming from his unblockable sword. "This is not going to work, Ichigo, we need to change tactics here. If you keep this up, he'll wear down in a few minutes at most." Ichigo didn't disagree with Sode no Shirayuki's assessment, but he couldn't see any way that an attack wouldn't result into him getting the worse of it. Still, keeping up the current pattern wouldn't lead anywhere good, so Ichigo grit his teeth and charged forward at the captain, attempting a counter-attack for the first time since realizing how dangerous their opponent's swordsmanship was. Hiriko seemed amused by that, grinning, which with his prominent front teeth looked somewhat lopsided. "Found your courage, have you? At least I'll get some fun out of it." Ichigo had expected the slash coming from the left, if not quite so fast, and so he unleashed the power of Sode no Shirayuki out of the entire left side of his waist, creating a huge and constantly growing armor. It ruined his balance, and badly so, but having expected it, Ichigo was able to compensate for it, while Hiriko was caught by surprise for a moment as the armor grew in the way of his strike at a pace just fast enough to keep the blade at bay, even if the resistance offered to the ice was next to nothing. The blade still needed to cut through it physically regardless. And thus, Ichigo managed to just barely stab the very tip of his Zanpakuto in Hiriko's tight. The captain backpedaled out of range far faster than Ichigo thought possible, but it didn't matter, because the moment he'd had the blade inside of him, Ichigo had frozen all of the blood he could reach in that spot, resulting in a sudden explosion of ice that left a gaping hole in Hiriko's leg, even if a small one no larger than a finger. But small or not, Hiriko stopped to watch it, and said in a very annoyed tone, even as the wound started to knot itself together very slowly, "I don't know what you were planning to accomplish, you won't take me down with hits like these." Ichigo hadn't really had any serious plan, he'd just wanted to change the pace of the battle and score at least one meaningful hit, but before he could answer, his eyes were drawn to Hiriko's sword, which seemed lesser, somehow. "You can see it, can't you? You realize what that means?" It took him just a moment longer than it had for Sode no Shirayuki, but then he understood, his eyes widening in surprise for a moment before he turned a self-assured grin toward Hiriko. "Really? Because from what I can see, to heal yourself you need to draw Ryotsu away from the sword, so that it's not as strong as otherwise would have been. Which means that if you try to maintain that advantage, I can take you down with 1,000 cuts, and if you don't, then I can fight this on even footing. What I see is that you're not as strong as you pretend you are." The Vizard frowned at that comment. "You know, you really are talented, you pick up on things quite fast, and are very adaptable. If you're sure that you've found the way to win, then come at me, why don't you? Let's see if your sword can be as cutting as your words." Ichigo charged ahead once again, hoping to take advantage of Hiriko's weakness as his wound was still mid-healing. However, as he went for a strike, the captain merely raised his sword in a block position, and while the sword didn't change at all, Ichigo had to abort his attack as a sudden sense of doom filled him, as if he'd been a hair from death. He watched warily and asked, trying to understand why he was feeling so terrified. What's going on? You're lacking conviction, that's what." Ichigo was left confused at that, and Hiriko explained, making a lazy slash with his sword. "A Zanpakuto isn't just a weapon, it's an extension of yourself. Sharing your Ryotsu with it is one aspect of Zanjutsu, talking with the spirit is another, learning from it is a third, and in addition to all that, you can charge your Ryotsu as well. It's similar to Hakuta, the sword will respond to your intention and do what you want it to do." He took a step forward, tapping the blade to a nearby rock. He didn't even push it through, only touching the edge to it, and yet the stone broke into two pieces as if perfectly cut, while he commented. If you strike with the intent to cut through, then your determination and emotions will empower the sword. However, instead of merely taking the properties of the emotion, since a Zanpakuto shares the link with your soul, what it does is take your desires, your will, and make them manifest. If you wish to cut through, then the blade will become sharper, to better bring your will into reality. Wish it to stop your enemy, it'll become an unyielding obstacle. That doesn't explain how you did, whatever it is you did there. You manipulated my feelings so I couldn't strike, or something like that. Hirako shook his head. I did nothing of the sort, the fault is your own. You are fighting to survive, trying to keep me busy and avoid being hit. Your sword, your body, your every movement, even as you control your surface emotions, deep down everything is being held back by your fear. I simply willed my sword to be ready to cut through and kill any who dared strike me. Your senses could feel it, how the weakness of your will would be unable to stand up to my intent to kill, and you backed down on reflex. It all sounded unbelievable to Ichigo, but Hirako didn't seem to care, letting out a long breath, and Ichigo realized that, while he was talking, the man's wound had recovered completely. You pick up things quickly, I'll give you that, but your Zanjutsu can't match mine, and nor can any of the other Shinigami arts you know. Give up, and spare yourself the pain. Ichigo, of course, wasn't going to do that. He gritted his teeth, and decided that, if his enemy was right, he might as well try and copy what he just did. From what he'd heard, it didn't seem that complicated, he just needed to truly want something, and his blade would refine itself to suit his purpose, like the living tool it actually was, but before he could, Sode no Shirayuki's voice echoed in his mind. Don't do it. He's trying to lure you into trying, it's a trap. Ichigo didn't even have the time to process the idea, as his sword didn't let him, going on in a urgent tone. It doesn't matter even if you can suddenly manage to do what he's explained, he's had centuries to perfect the technique. I bet that, if two people with an equal will to cut through clash, the one with the stronger sword will win. And if not that, he'll have some other way to circumvent it. He wants you to overextend, don't fall for it. Ichigo nodded grimly. Even if Sode no Shirayuki might be wrong, it was too real and too big a risk to take it right now. Still, that left him with no ability to affect the battle. As Hirako had said, he was his superior in each of the Shinigami arts, so whatever he tried, the man likely had some counter for. Then don't try for them, surprise him instead. You remember how you earned my support, right? You hid what you could do, and used the trick your friend had taught you at just the right moment to catch me off guard, and you've been discussing with him how his powers work now, have seen them in use. You've been using the sensing methods from 3 different schools for a while now, surely you can combine more stuff? And then there are the weapons your Quincy friend left you, which he won't be expecting. He wants you to face him on his battlefield, don't do that, drag him on yours. Ichigo's eyes widened at the idea, and then he grinned. This, he could do. It didn't matter if he managed to win or not, so long as he could keep the captain on the back foot and force him to face things he'd not experienced before, he had a chance. Hirako clearly noticed as Ichigo steeled his resolve, and seemed about to say something, but Ichigo didn't let him, darting forward with Shunpo once more. The captain scoffed at that, raising his weapon in a defense position, and once more, Ichigo could feel the dread coming from it, but he didn't let that deter him. He wasn't going to let himself get cut down. Instead, just as he was about to strike, he used the full bringer step, making the air bounce him laterally at the last moment. He didn't have the focus or practice for more than one such step at a time, reverting to Shunpo immediately afterward, but he achieved what he wanted, Hirako's counter-strike going wide as he struck down with his sword, willing to cut through with all of his willpower. Hirako had expected that, just as Sode no Shirayuki suspected, and managed to dodge out of the way, but Ichigo didn't stop there, creating a crescent of ice with his sword swing, except that, just a moment before moving his blade away, he pushed his own Ryutsu inside it, hardening and toughening it up the same way Chad had taught him to do for his skin, before using an Hakuta kick to send the blade forward. And even as Hirako's sword cut it in two, the two parts kept moving onward, maintaining their form and momentum thanks to the way Ichigo had reinforced them, embedding themselves into Hirako's body. The captain stumbled back, surprised at having been hit, and Ichigo pressed his advantage, darting forward once more. Hiriko's wild swing with his sword forced him to about the charge, but Ichigo had been expecting it, so he threw a handful of the Jinto spheres that Uryu had given him. Unlike Uryu, Ichigo had no ability to activating them at will, so he'd been given simpler ones that activated upon hitting a target and immediately releasing the Reishi within, which in this case manifested into a set of explosions. His enemy only looked a bit singed by that, much like the wounds from the ice spikes he'd been hit by had only been superficial, but Ichigo didn't care, slashing his sword twice to create 2 ice walls which he hardened and then pushed forward with a single slap of his hand, forcing Hiriko to dodge for once, rather than letting him simply cut down anything he didn't want to be hit by, which set the man on the collision course with the path of another group of Jinto. The man managed to avoid most of them, catching the last one in an extended fist. Ichigo could see the Ryotsu around that hand hardening as it did, clearly planning to contain the explosion within to minimize damage, which was why he grinned when the silver capsule unleashed a torrent of electricity on Hiriko. Despite being hit with however much power the electrical discharge had, Hiriko was far from defeated. Even as he looked decidedly singed and wounded now, he caught himself in midair from his previous fall, in a brilliant show of reflexes that Ichigo hadn't been expecting, but he was still reeling, if only slightly, so Ichigo went on the offensive once more, this time feinting with his sword only to slam a fist straight into Hiriko's face. Of course, the man's face was hard as steel, something Ichigo couldn't match with Hakuta alone, but by combining it with Chad's body reinforcing trick, Ichigo's hand also didn't break. Then, in a sudden moment of inspiration as his punch rebounded back from Hiriko's undamaged face, he created a similar area of distorted air as he would for the Fullbringer jumping technique, except this time behind his elbow, so that the punch bounced straight back into Hiriko's face, so fast and quick that he'd delivered 5 in succession, in the process managing to leave a bruise despite the hardened Ryotsu there, before he had to disengage due to Hiriko's latest attempt to cut him in 2 with his sword. Just as he left, however, Ichigo dropped another Jinto to the ground, then used the barest of Hakuta pushes from the top of his feet to have it slide just the short distance necessary to be under Hiriko's raised feet, and the moment the Vizard stepped on it, a set of 7 bars of glowing, vibrating Reishi surrounded him, like a sort of birdcage made of energy. Ichigo was left winded and breathing heavily by the exchange, but then grinned at the sight of the captain caught behind bars and shouted back. "So, who is it who doesn't know how to fight now?" Hiriko didn't answer at first, instead massaging his bruised cheek for a few moments, before slowly turning on himself, examining the cage that was holding him. Once done with that, he refocused his gaze onto Ichigo, delivering his answer in a tone that sounded almost pleased. "I will admit that you're full of surprises. I think that, if given a century or 2, you could grow to become a serious contender. The quick wits would certainly help. In respect of the determination you showed, I'm willing to give you another chance to surrender. I promise I won't hurt you if you do. I just need to be told all you know of Aizen and then I'll even let you go." Ichigo watched the man with incredulity before shouting back. "What are you talking about? You're caught and trapped. I've won." "No, boy, you've really not. It was a valiant effort, to be sure, but to defeat a captain of the Godai 13 will take more than what you've shown me so far." Then, the man raised his sword above his head, eyes closed in concentration, and Ichigo saw that a few wounds that had seemed to be slowly regenerating stopped doing so immediately, a few of the closed ones even losing a few droplets of blood as if about to reopen. Meanwhile, Hiriko's sword started to become a magnet for all of his attention, looking more real than anything he'd even seen before, while the sense of doom he'd felt before started to reach him where he was, even if now he was several meters away from Hiriko's position, instead of the few centimeters he'd been at when the man had last used the attack. And suddenly, Hiriko struck, the blade going through the bars like they weren't even there, only for a sudden blast of repulsive Ryotsu charged with disdain sent a portion of them flying away before they dissolved into glowing blue dust, while Hiriko stepped out of the opening he'd just made in his supposedly inescapable cage with the least amount of care in the world. The man raised an eyebrow at Ichigo, as if mocking his surprise, before adding, "I've faced Quincy before. The trick to defeating those blades of theirs is to struck in between the vibrations, in that split second when the Reishi is standing still. These ones didn't even a high enough frequency to make it challenging, looked like a shoddy job put together in a couple days, if you ask me." Then he pointed his sword at Ichigo, all the humor vanishing from his voice as he continued. "Now surrender, or else I'll start getting angry." Rather than comply, Ichigo threw all of his remaining Jinto at once, smashing them all into the ground. 8 of them were hollow bait, while the other 3 turned into large smoke curtains that covered the battlefield, and with the baits there, it'd take time for Hirako to determine his real position. Which didn't change the fact that Ichigo was seriously considering just trying to see if there was a way to just escape this dimensional prison on his own at this point. He'd used everything he had and could think of, and while he'd struck a couple of good blows, the man seemed barely fazed by it all. And he had nothing else left now. No, there is one more thing we could try. Ichigo was left speechless by those words, and then Sode no Shirayuki added, sounding grimly determined. I'll explain in your inner world, but be quick now, we need to get this done before he finds the real you, we've only a few minutes at most. As if to punctuate the warning, Ichigo felt one of the hollow baits disappear, and so gripped his blade tightly in front of his face and closed his eyes to force himself into a meditative space, hoping desperately that, whatever his Zanpakuto spirit was planning, it'd be able to actually help. Check the description for the links to the author.